On this episode of The Powers Project.
I need to come out there. I can't tell you how many people I have out in Washington State that I've interviewed. I actually have a dear friend out there. She lives out there, and I said, I should just bring my mic and everything out to Washington State and interview a bunch of people while I'm out there. Because
If
that
you
whole
do come up to my ranch, I'll show you a great time. I live at
oh
the top
really?
of a mountain on 40 acres, and I've got a full training range for firearms and protection dogs up there. I've made my own little appropriately violent Disneyland to retire
Two, one, and we're live. Jeff, how you doing today, sir?
on. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining me today. I know that you had a busy day today and doing something that you probably don't enjoy doing very much. So hopefully this will be more enjoyable than being in a suit all day.
I've been looking forward to it all week, so I hope so.
So for those who don't know, you just wrote a book called Patriot Gangster, and it's about your time in the outlaw motorcycle clubs. And there's a couple things I wanted to ask you, like where did this term outlaw come from? Because I've always heard, as I'm sure most people have, they're always called outlaw motorcycle gangs, and you don't call them gangs, you call them clubs. But I find it counterintuitive to call something outlaw and then call it a club. So how did that all come about?
Okay, so I'll have to give you a little history lesson on motorcycle club culture, because where that term outlaw really dates back to is the late 1940s, early 1950s, when several of the clubs were seeing veterans returning from World War II, and those veterans had PTSD. Of course, it was undiagnosed back then because we didn't talk about it until my generation. But those guys came back with their PTSD. They didn't fit into society. They were a little edgy and a little more stand up for themselves than the rest of the world or rest of America. And when they started forming motorcycle clubs, you saw that in their motorcycle clubs. Their patch designs were different. They just behaved differently. They were more committed to the lifestyle of riding the motorcycle all the time and living your life around that culture. And what ended up happening is the AMA, the American Motorcycle Association, who had a monopoly on motorcycle clubs at the time. If you wanted to create a club or start a motorcycle club, the AMA had to sanction it. And those outlaw clubs, because of the way they acted and the way they looked, they wouldn't dress the same way as all the AMA required or AMA sanctioned clubs were required to. And eventually the AMA said, you know what, you guys aren't allowed to come to our races and participate anymore. You're outlaws. And the club said, okay, if we're outlaws, we're outlaws. Screw the AMA, fuck you. And they cut their one-piece AMA patches into 3 separate parts and sewed it on the back of their vest. And that's where the 3-piece patch came from. And that's where the term outlaw motorcycle club came from. It's not because they were committing crimes. It's because they weren't sanctioned by the American Motorcycle Association. And they went out and held their own races and their own runs and parties, and contrary to the AMA. And what you saw happen was the motorcycle club culture that had been started by these preppy, squared away AMA folks really got popular because of what the returning veterans created with the outlaw clubs. And so that's where the term outlaw motorcycle club got started. But where the term outlaw motorcycle gang got started was in 1965 with the Lynch report, when Attorney General Lynch in California wrote this. He was trying to get reelected, and he needed a bad guy similar to the mafia to show that he was tough on crime and all about law and order. And so at the time, the Hells Angels were getting a lot of press because it was, the early 60s, and there was a lot of stuff going on in the motorcycle club world at that time related to, free love and drugs and just doing what you wanted to do. It was the 60s. And Attorney General Lynch, rather than focusing on the facts, he took a few little incidents from the Angels and portrayed them as organized crime incidents, even though the cases that he was basing them off of never led to any charges. And so there were really no crimes. There was just this story that Attorney General Lynch told in his report, which became known as the Lynch Report, and grabbed national headlines saying that, motorcycle gangs are coming to terrorize all across America. And that was actually the articles that spurred off the Lynch Report were the first articles that referred to outlaw motorcycle clubs as terrorists. And it wouldn't be until 2010 when the ATF and their intelligence unit would issue a report called Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs in the Military. And they would claim that those of us that have military training are domestic terrorist threats simply because we belong to motorcycle clubs or outlaw motorcycle clubs. And at that point, we really became outlawed, because once you're a domestic terrorist threat, Department of Homeland Security gets to step in, the Patriot Act comes in, and the Constitution goes out the window. So all bets are off, and you're labeled a gangster at that point. So even though I've got no criminal history, and I spent 9 years and 6 months with a badge in my pocket working in law enforcement, I am considered a gangster and an organized crime member by law enforcement intelligence on the federal, state, and local level. Totally unfair, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, so let me ask you about that, because that seems kind of like contrarian, like where you're part of a motorcycle club, an outlaw motorcycle club, mind you, just because the AMA deemed you so, and
Right.
yet you were in law enforcement for almost 10 years. So which one did you join first, and how did that come about?
I joined the 1% Outlaw Motorcycle Club world first, and I did that when I was 21 years old. You have to be 21 to join a 1% motorcycle club in the United States. So I knew from the time I was about 8 years old, when I first saw Hell's Angels riding together in California, that I was like, oh, I want to be one of those guys. I want to ride with them. They were riding side by side, just a couple inches off each other's pegs, perfect formation. And it was super impressive. And they looked free and wild and tough. And, I said, someday I want to be like those guys. And so I did everything I could to research the Hells Angels. And then that led me to researching every motorcycle club in the country, because I found out very quick when I got involved in the Outlaw Motorcycle Club world, it was in the mid 90s, mid and late 90s. And at that point, the club wars were still going on. And so you had to know the history of all the clubs. So you'd know where you could travel, where you couldn't travel, what feuds were going on, how to avoid them, what protocol you needed to know not to get a black eye or get your teeth knocked out or get killed. I mean, it was a dangerous world. But when I was 21 years old, I had learned enough by reading every book I could read, because we really didn't have the internet at the time like they do now. Now you've got so many internet educated bikers, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the internet, and so I had to read everything I could. And then once I thought I knew enough that I might only get a black eye or some teeth knocked out, but I probably wouldn't get killed, then I hopped on my old Sportster, my very first Sportster I had, which was a 74 XLCH, piece of crap. But it was what I could afford, and at the time. And when I was 21 years old, I hopped on the bike and I started riding down to California, and I started hanging out with the Daly City chapter and the San Fernando Valley chapter and the Oakland chapter, and going to their runs and their parties that were open to the public, so I could be around them and I could talk to them and I could hear their stories and learn how they talked and how they walked. And I wouldn't realize it until years later when I got trained in undercover work, but I was doing my own research to infiltrate. I didn't have a malicious intent. I just wanted to know the truth about the motorcycle club world, because I had heard the same thing that the public hears, which is they're all a bunch of criminals and gangsters. They treat their women horribly. They sell drugs. They steal motorcycles. They pimp women and murder people. And from being around the Hells Angels and going to those parties and talking to them and learning some of the stories and seeing how the cops treat them in particular, I was like, wait, there's more to the story than what I've read. And whether it's from law enforcement or from the books that were written by bikers, which were only a couple at the time, there's more to the story, and I need to figure this out. And so at 21, when I was eligible to prospect for the club, I was like, okay, it's time for me I know what I need to know to hang around these guys. I want to become a prospect because I don't believe they're a criminal enterprise. But in order to find out, I'm going to have to get closer. I'm going to have to really, know them. And so I hopped on my bike, rode back down to Oakland, knocked on the door of the Oakland clubhouse, and a prospect answered the door. And I'm like, hey, my name is Jeff. I'm from Seattle. I'd like to go prospect for the Hells Angels Oakland chapter. And he's like, what the fuck did you say? And I repeated it. He laughs at me. And it was that, I'm going to kick your ass in just a few minutes, but hold on. And he shut the steel door on me, that they have at the front of the clubhouse. And I could hear him going inside, and all right, whatever. We'll see how this works out, I figured I was fairly safe as long as I was on the street. The next thing I know, this big hairy dude, I mean, typical what you expect of a hardcore Hells Angel from Oakland. Huge guy, big beard, long hair, comes to the door, and he's like, what the fuck do you want? And I'm like, hey, man, I'm Jeff. I'm from Seattle, Washington. And I'd like to go prospect for the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. And he smiled this big smile. He's like, come in, I want to talk. And he takes me inside. We go upstairs and we sit down. we have a couple drinks, and he's like, you know how close you are to getting your ass beat by all of us? And I'm like, yeah, man, but I heard that if you want to become a Hell's Angel, you got to go find one. And I don't like the ones in our state because they just started a chapter and they were patching over from an existing club that had been in here in Washington for a lot of years. And it was full of a bunch of methamphetamine addicts. And I don't touch the stuff, can't tolerate it. And that was not who I wanted to call my brothers. And so I was willing to drive all the way to California and move there just to be a Hell's Angel. And so that's the route I started going. And the big guy who opened the door was Moldy Marvin Gilbert, he's passed away now, but Marvin is one of the most legendary Hell's Angels that you will ever hear about. He was super talented guy. He was an enforcer for their club, but he was also a beautiful writer, wrote these great short stories, hardcore biker. And Marvin, he was an original Oakland guy, but after Washington got started, he came up here and squared the Washington guys away. And that's how I ended up coming back up here and eventually asking to go prospect with the Washington Nomads chapter of the Hells Angels. And that's how I met, who is to this day my best friend, Josh Binder. And he, at the time, was one of the most notorious enforcers the Hells Angels had ever had. He took me under his wing and mentored me, and he was going to be my sponsor into the club, because if you're going to prospect, you have to have a sponsor. And so Josh was going to do that for me, and I hung around like you're supposed to and was going through the process. And it was, I can't remember if it was right before or right after the USA run that year. I think it was right before the USA run that year. He told me, I'm at his house having dinner with some Hells Angels and him, and he's like, hey, bro, come out here. I want to talk to you for a second. We sit on his desk or on his porch, and he's like, hey, there's some shit going on in the club. I can't talk to you about it right now, obviously, because that's the rules. You can't, if I'm not in the club, if I'm not a patch member, even if I'm a prospect, I can't know what's going on in the club. And so he couldn't tell me about it, but he's like, I just want you to sit back and watch. If you don't like what you see, you're not far off of long. You haven't done anything that you can't just walk away. And, if you do like what you see and you're okay with what you see happen over the next month, I'll make sure you become the best Hells Angel we've ever had. I'm like, all right, sounds fair enough for me. I trust you, bro. That's what you're supposed to do. Trust him with your life. And he's giving me life advice. And so I sat back and watched, and what I saw happen was he got stabbed in the back. Here's one of the most loyal guys you will ever meet. To this day, he's still that way. And he was absolutely loyal to the club. He was like I was with the Outsiders when I became a member with that 1% club. But it's just one of those guys that's so loyal to the club, so loyal to the brothers. He's proven himself in every way. He's taking care of some dirty work. You don't expect him to be put out bad, and you don't expect him to say bad things about the club. But all of a sudden, I watched him quit. He called me one day on a Thursday night when they were supposed to be having a meeting, and he's like, hey, bro, I just quit the club. I want you to be the first to know. I hope this doesn't change stuff between us, but I just quit the club. I'm like, whoa, okay. That makes me reevaluate whether or not I want to keep going forward, and within a day or two, another really respected enforcer quit the club to support Josh. And at that point, I was like, all right, you know what? I know enough from hearing rumors that I have an idea what's going on, and I don't want any part of this. That's not brotherhood. That's guys stabbing each other in the back to try and feel cool. And that's not what I was seeking in the club. And so I decided I didn't want to be a Hells Angel, and I went my own way. And eventually in 2007, I've been doing contracting work, and I've been doing criminal defense investigations for all the various outlaw motorcycle clubs, because that's part of my skill set, is investigations. And so I've been helping them out whenever they got indicted for anything, had a lot of really good success there. And in 2007, when my daughter got old enough to realize what's going on overseas and the guys are getting their head lopped off on YouTube, it was time for me to find a job that wasn't going to scare her all the time. The problem is when you've got a skill set that includes things like advanced special operations deployment and hostage rescue, that doesn't fit into normal society, right? The jobs you can go out and get that you can support your family on they're not there. And so I had to do something else. And I ended up getting recruited to go to work for a guy, not for a guy, for an agency. I was working another case at the time where we had a witness that did some stuff that wasn't, it was a criminal defense case. It wasn't on the up and up. And so we had to report that. And when we did, they sent an undercover investigator who was supervisor of the unit that was in charge of investigating that crime to come visit me at my office. And he was wearing flip-flops and a Hawaiian shirt and shorts, had a badge and a gun on. I'm like, dude, you've got the greatest gig in the world. You get to wear flip-flops and shorts to work? He's like, man, I work undercover 4 days a week, and that's full time for us. And this is how I get to dress. I was like, you're the supervisor and you get to dress like Magnum PI? I need to come work for you. And that was just kind of a joke. Well, about 6 months later, he calls me up out of the blue one day. He's like, hey, Jeff, we need a new undercover guy, and I think you'd be perfect. You want to come in and interview for it? I can get you a panel interview. And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll come in and interview. So I went in and I started the process. It was a long process, because you go in for your panel interviews, and there was 3 of those, and then you got your background investigation. I ended up getting hired. And next thing you know, I'm wearing, I don't think I ever wore flip-flops to work, because to me, that just seemed like a safety thing. I need to be able to kick somebody if I needed to. But, I worked undercover for 9 years and 6 months after that. And before I could do that, though, that put me on a crossroads, because you can't be a 1%er and be an active duty cop. That's just the way that the protocol works. But I had almost 10 years with the club world, proved myself as Jeff. I hadn't become Twitch yet. I was Jeff. I had a couple other nicknames guys called me by, but I was Jeff. Everybody knew who I was. All the clubs did, the Banditos, the Hells Angels, the Jokers, everybody knew who I was and respected me. And so when I'm at a choice where I have to support my family and I have to earn a legal income that can support my family, and I also have to, if I'm going to take that job, I got to turn my back on the club world forever and give up all those friends and those brothers. I was like, fuck it, I want both. And I'm willing to ask to have both, then just say, I know the rules, I'm giving up, and you'll never see me again. And so I went to the Angels first, because I had the closest relationship with them. And I said, hey guys, here's what I'm doing. You guys know me, but this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be investigating organized crime groups, but it's Eastern Euro stuff and Mexican drug cartels and no bikers whatsoever. And I'd have to conflict out if I did investigate a biker case. So plus, I just don't think they'll ever assign me one, and talked to the Angels, told them what I wanted to do. At the time, they were getting ready to go through their RICO case here in Washington, and we all decided that, hey, that job would, if I got called to testify as an expert for the defense, that job would give me credibility to stand up against the prosecution's experts. They're outlaw motorcycle gang investigators. And so they okayed it. And from there, I just went to the Gypsy Jokers next and said, hey, this is what I'm doing. And they're like, okay, you're Jeff, whatever. And did the same thing with the Banditos. And at that point I stopped. I was like, brother, the 3 biggies in my state don't care. And, okay, I'll take the job. And, so everybody was aware of what I did, but because I had proven myself, I'd proven my loyalty, they knew that I wasn't going to be the guy to cause problems, and they could allow me to do that. And it was better to allow me to earn a legal income that I could provide for my family for than, I think they were all worried that I would give up the job and do whatever I had to be part of the club world, which I might have at the time. I mean, that was a long decision for me. And I seriously thought about, screw it, I'll figure out a way to make money, and I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I talked to them. I'm glad they said, hey man, get a legal job. We don't care what it is. And they were, my own club, and all the clubs around me really that knew what I was doing for a living. They never ever put any pressure on me to try and get any information that they couldn't get, or any of that. It was always, make sure you're keeping your nose clean. Don't do anything that's going to risk your job. Don't do anything that's going to screw you over with the club and your job. And they really protected me. And at one point I had a couple of law enforcement officers that were harassing me via my employment, trying to get me fired because they didn't like the fact I was a 1%er and I carried a badge. And the clubs actually stood up for me. And the Confederation of Clubs, which represents all the motorcycle clubs in Washington State, including all the outlaw clubs, they had their attorney represent me for free when those guys started messing with me at work and trying to get me fired. And so, the clubs were very much aware of it, but I'm the only guy, to my knowledge, that's ever, that wasn't working in infiltration, that's ever carried a badge and been a 1%er at the same time, and the only reason that happened was because, like I said, for 10 years, I've been mentored by some of the most hardcore individuals in the 1% outlaw motorcycle club world. And I'd represented myself the way they had taught me to. And so there was no question
So let me. All right. So let's stop there for just a second because I want to
Sure.
ask you a few questions because there's a lot of conflicting. How can I put it? There's a lot of conflicting information, and what I mean by that is this. So I remember reading in your book, it's saying that the clubs wanted you to get a job so you had a legal way to take care of your family and stuff.
That's all
And
clubs. Yes.
okay, so and that was that just because they wanted to look like they weren't a criminal enterprise? Were they a criminal enterprise? I mean, were these clubs criminal enterprises, or were they just had some members that were doing criminal activity that didn't have anything to do with a club? Because
It,
I would think if they wanted you to have a job, that there's a good reason for that.
Okay, so let me kind of answer that because there's three things going on there. The first, the reason why outlaw motorcycle clubs want you to have a legal source of income is because, well, it's twofold. Number one, if you don't have a visible legal source of income, it's going to draw attention from federal law enforcement. And they're going to really start scrutinizing that particular member. How are you making your income? How are you surviving? Because outlaw motorcycle clubs are incredibly expensive to belong to, whether, when you add up the dues, the cost of the maintenance on the motorcycle, the cost of the Harley Davidson, because they're so freaking expensive now.
Yeah, they are.
Like buying a BMW. And then you've got all your travel and defense fund assessments and everything else that goes along with it. So you have to have a good income. And so the clubs want you to have a visible legal source of income so that the feds don't start putting excess heat on you to try and figure out what you're doing and harassing you and maybe find you doing something wrong. Because guys that don't have legal sources of income, they got to make money somehow. So the clubs really don't want those kind of people because they bring heat and they're a liability because that one person doing something wrong, when law enforcement busts them, it's not you are doing something wrong, it's your entire club is doing something wrong. It's never just an individual thing because they think we're these organized crime groups. But what I saw, and I've been intimately friendly with every major 1% motorcycle club in the country, the Mongols, the Hells Angels, the Vagos, the Outlaws, Sons of Silence, Pagans, us, the Outsiders, none of them are organized crime groups. They just aren't. They're too dysfunctional to be organized crime groups. In fact, motorcycle clubs are some of the most dysfunctional groups I have ever been around because everybody wants to be the guy. They want to be the respected guy that the community talks about and looks to as a legend, like Sonny Barger, like me when I was in the world, and Double D, and some of these other guys, Gimme Jimmy, that have done a lot for the culture and earned that respect. Everybody wants it, but most people aren't willing to put in the work and the commitment that it takes to earn that reputation. And so there's a lot of backstabbing and infighting, and they just could never function like organized crime.
So is there, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is with each club, there's not one particular leader, there's no hierarchy, there's no, group of guys who run the club. It's just,
No, every club is a little bit different. So you look at like the Hells Angels, for example. There's no national leader there. They're all a bunch of individual franchises like McDonald's, and each charter, each franchise has its own president. And so that's why when it comes to things like solving problems or getting that club to go in one consistent direction in the United States, they can't do it because they got so many, cooks and not a chef,
Right.
not one single chef. Whereas if you look at clubs like the Pagans, they do have a motherboard, a mother chapter made up of 13 members that kind of guide the club. But again, there's voting membership that plays into what they can and can't do. And
okay, so
then you look at
I'm sorry. So let's take a step back. So your friend Josh was an enforcer. So as an enforcer, I imagine that, just the sound of it is, enforcing certain rules and laws that are part of your chapter. So as an enforcer, was he just enforcing those rules and laws of that particular chapters? He wasn't an enforcer for all of Hell's Angels?
No, he was just an enforcer for that particular chapter and their area of responsibility. And so, just like when I was an enforcer for my chapter, it was just specifically stuff that was related to.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to ask you that. So you were an enforcer.
Yes.
Are you at liberty to tell me what that description is? like what's your job description as an enforcer?
So an enforcer is not, with most 1% clubs, it's not an official title, but you're basically the special operations unit. When something needs to be done, needs to be handled, and it needs to be handled by somebody with some security expertise and effectiveness, whether it's an external threat, like when we had another club that was going to bomb one of our motorcycle shops and attack our clubhouse. You task the enforcer to take care of your security. And so, like, I was put in charge of hardening our clubhouse so that if they did try and attack us, we wouldn't sustain too many casualties and hopefully any. And then there were other instances where one of the members he had his restaurant burned down by some gang members. And so I was sent to go investigate that and protect that member and his family while, things got worked out and with that gang.
Okay. So did your job description ever include banging heads?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So,
but I was never asked to. It's funny. We all are so aware of RICO that nobody will ever ask you, hey man, will you go do this? It's always, this is the problem we've got. Man, it'd be great if somebody would solve it. And then you've got guys like me and Josh who are so hardcore and loyal because we're from the old days when you had to be that way about the club. They'll just volunteer. We'll raise our hand when nobody's around. It's always done when there's not enough around. You've got one guy who's got some juice, but the rest in the chain of command aren't there because we don't want to create a RICO situation. And it's always, man, there's this problem. It'd be great if somebody solved it. And that's the code for
right.
Okay.
So, all right. So, did you ever find yourself in a conundrum where you're a police officer and you're in law enforcement and you're an enforcer, and did those two things ever conflict as far as like banging heads and yet you're law enforcement? Did you ever?
No, like I said, I kept those two lives completely separate. And so when I got off the clock every day, I was Twitch, and I was Twitch for the rest of until I went back to work at 4 a.m.
Okay, so but all right, so here's my thing though. So would you consider your job as an enforcer and that some of the things may have been considered illegal, like banging people's heads? Okay, so how did you rectify that as being a law enforcement officer and an enforcer and be able to be okay with those things?
My loyalty was not to my job, and my personal identity was not my career. That was something I did during the day, 4 days a week to earn a paycheck, and other than that, that's all it was. And I put my heart and soul into doing it good and never crossed the line or broke any laws doing my job, which when you work undercover, it's real easy to cross the line.
Oh yeah.
Because I was so scared of doing it, being a 1%er, that I knew they'd throw the book at me if I did, so I never did it. But the thing about it, because I was a 1%er first and foremost, when it came time to go take care of things or sock somebody up, I looked at it like UFC or like a fight club. You know what you're getting involved in when you sign up. When you join an outlaw motorcycle club, if you disrespect somebody, you're going to get socked in the mouth for it. That's the rules of the culture, and the punishments go up from there. So if you stab somebody, you better be prepared for the consequences for something like that, or if you shoot them. And I guess that's how that's the other way that we're outlaws is we believe in an eye for an eye, and it can't be that wrong because it's in the Bible. But, the reason we don't do that, we don't allow that here in America as our form of justice, is because then only the strong would survive and we'd have no weak. And so laws were put in place so we couldn't do that. And so the corruption wouldn't run rampant. But I never looked at it as, I knew I was doing something illegal when I was doing it, but I didn't care because it was like, man, you signed up for this when your actions caused me to come see you. So if you hadn't done what you did, I wouldn't be coming to see you. Just like every time that I had something happen to me, I accepted responsibility for it. Like the incident with Josh in that hotel room that you probably read about in the book. I mean, that dude was sent to kill me, and he ended up becoming one of my best friends because when it was going down and he realized he couldn't kill me at that time, and he gave me that ultimatum to let me get out of that room, I stood up, shook his hand, and said, hey, man, I understand there's nothing personal about this. This was just business. And it was because I knew I had fucked up by getting involved with those two idiots, that caused him to be there. He wasn't there for me. I mean, I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, so I was going to get it too. But,
you know, here's the thing, and this is going to be a bit of a challenge for me during this podcast, because your story is so freaking amazing and out. I mean, just I sit here and and reading your book and talking to you briefly, and I go, holy crap, there is so much to cover. I mean, the fact that you have had attempts on your life, you've been kidnapped or attempted kidnapping on.
I've been kidnapped twice.
You've been kidnapped. Was that here or abroad?
You're going to make me cry if I have to get into that. Sorry.
Okay. We won't get into that then. You know, I just go, wow, this. At some point for anybody, that's got to be overwhelming to live that kind of lifestyle, and then on top of it to have these two opposites, you know, law enforcement and motorcycle clubs. I don't even know how you dealt with that.
I didn't realize the amount of stress I was putting myself under. It just, you know, you like when you grow up as an American male in America, at least, like, I don't know what it's like to grow up in America today, because I did it back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. But when I did it, you still had real men around, and you were still taught to stand up for yourself no matter what. And, you know, like, you were taught to go out and seek adventure and you know, fulfill your dreams. And so that's what I did. But nobody tells you when you're growing up that sometimes your dreams are way too extreme for the normal person or for anybody to deal with. Like, I look at what Josh has dealt with from being in the club world for 5 years. That's all he was in for, was 5 years. And I was in for 22. And the amount of stress and PTSD he has from his 5 years, it is horrible. And my PTSD comes from everything I did in the motorcycle club world, everything I did in my professional career, and then everything I've had done to me, you know? And what I realized is it was one thing to be a 1%er. It was a totally different thing. And you compound your stress when you pick up that badge and you're allowed to do both, like I was. It worked out great for all of us involved, except for me, because I didn't realize the stress I was putting myself under, because I was living two separate lives.
Yeah.
Right.
Just living two separate lives, regardless of what it is, but to the magnitude of these things that you live two separate lives doing. Holy crap. I mean, geez.
Well, and then on top of that, when I start working undercover, when you go to work, you got a different life, because that's not any of them, you know, and my vehicles weren't registered to me, you know. It's like, so I had three separate lives, two that were real, one that was fake, but it had real consequences if I fucked up, you know, and it's where my paycheck came from. And you live that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for your entire adult life, from the time I was 21 until I was 42 years old, a little over 42 when I quit. I think I was 42, 43. I'm almost 46 now. And what I realized as my daughter got close to 18 years old is she doesn't know who her dad is, because she never got to meet her real dad. She got to meet bits and pieces of real dad. She got to meet the ski racing coach dad and the guy who would come home after work and be grumpy and shit, you know, but she never got to meet me because she couldn't come around the club because it was too dangerous for her. And it's not a place for kids, or it wasn't back then. Now all of a sudden people are bringing their kids around 1% clubs, which makes no sense to me, but whatever. You know, then she started living her own life and our schedules got less frequent. And when she was 18, or about 18, is when I started coming out of undercover work, and I could start telling her about some of the stuff that I had done. And it wasn't good. She realized, man, I don't understand my dad. I now understand why he's all messed up in the head and grumpy, but I don't understand what he's been doing his entire adult life.
So did you ever get therapy for this? Did you ever see someone to?
Oh, yeah. Well, along the way, I mean, when you suffer through the things I've suffered through,
you would have to, yeah.
You have to, yeah. But it wasn't until after I came out, you know, and by then, you know, you're like everybody else, man. You know, everything I've seen and done, and then everything I've had done to me, there's no minimizing that. And because I chose to try and have this action hero, you know, life as a young man, thinking that would be a good idea, being this ultimate tough guy. And I didn't realize until I was about 40 years old how fucked up I was. And that was not a good idea. I wish I hadn't done it now. It makes for a good book, but that book isn't making me rich. It hasn't even bought my wife and I dinner yet. So, I can't say that everything I went through in my life was worth it. I've had multiple attempts on my life. I've been kidnapped twice. I've been stabbed a bunch of times. I've been beaten with all sorts of things you can beat somebody with, and now I've got the cops messing with me and hunting me for the last 10 years. It's a miserable life.
So, all right, before I get into, because I want to talk about that a bit, I want to talk about the profiling that law enforcement's done on the motorcycle clubs. But 2 questions I have that come to mind right now. 1, if you had to do it all over again, would you? And 2, would you, if someone came to you, some young kid came to you and said, Jeff, I'm thinking about joining a motorcycle club, what would you tell them?
Read my books, read all 3 of them, and then make a decision. So to answer your first question, would I do it again? Hell fucking no. I'm really proud of what we did. I'm proud. Sorry, excuse me.
No, that's quite all right.
It's tough, man. You invest your entire life in something, and you're the bad guy your entire adult life when you shouldn't be the bad guy, and everyone around you the bad guy too, when they shouldn't be bad guys. And it's too easy when you write a book to have people look at you and say, you're talking about what you did. So yeah, I did some of this. The story couldn't have happened without me, but it also couldn't have happened without all those other men that you read about in the books from all those other clubs that helped unify together. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever been part of. And so when I answer the question, would I do it all over again? What we did was one of the most patriotic and fundamentally American things you can do as an American. We stood up against the biggest odds, and we succeeded, and we passed laws to protect bikers across America. So that was incredibly beautiful. But that's the only thing that makes me question whether or not I would say no if I was asked, would I do it again? Because I love that so much that I was part of that. But man, the damage it did to me, the damage it did to my family, and I'm not just talking about my immediate family. Later on in life, when I got married a couple of years ago, the ATF came in and ruined my wedding. And
what did they do?
So when the day after I announced that I was going to be releasing the book, it was February of last year. I was going through Master Canine Trainer Academy to get certified as a Master Canine Trainer. And they found out that I was going through dog training school. And so they had Department of Homeland Security call the director of the training academy, who was a former Navy SEAL. And, he's a doctor and he's the best canine trainer in the world. They called him and told him they were going to deport him because he's a foreign national. And then charge him with aiding and abetting an outlaw motorcycle gang for training me how to train dogs. And because I was supposed to be getting married the following month at his house, not only did I get kicked out of Dog Trainers Academy with no refund, and there goes my entire retirement fund because I had invested it in that. But he was the best man in my wedding, and we were supposed to get married with all our friends at his place, and I couldn't get married at his place, couldn't see him anymore, and lost that family that I had with them. And since then I've had undercover agents trying to set me up and entrap me. They deported me when I came back from Southeast Asia in September. They actually let me into the United States and then kicked me back out and took me into custody and gave me 3 different interrogations and some searches before they finally kicked me out and let me come back into America. It's been miserable. So would I do it again? Nah, man. What it did to my daughter and I's relationship, not worth it. But it's tempting because of how it made me feel as far as being a patriotic American and what we accomplished as a marginalized and totally misunderstood and vilified community. We did something great.
So, this is the thing. It's like I understand exactly where you're coming from because I've seen this firsthand, not to the extent that you have, obviously. But one of the things I get frustrated with are Americans out there who they've lived such a privileged life that they actually have the audacity to say something like, well, if you don't want to be, if you don't want to be arrested, you don't want to, have to deal with the police, then don't commit crimes. And they have no clue that you don't have to commit a crime. You just
Right.
have to be part of a group that they don't like.
Right.
And that's what's happened. That's what happened to you being part of the motorcycle club, is that, and then they start profiling like they do black people.
Correct.
And I've made this mention that I've had several black friends, and I've been pulled over, or my friend has been pulled over simply because he was black and I was white. We weren't doing anything wrong,
Right.
but we just got profiled because if there's a black guy and a white guy in a car, there's got to be something wrong. And so you found that to be the case with them doing this to motorcycle clubs as well.
Yeah, I don't want to minimalize or what African Americans or the Hispanic community or any other minorities that have been dealing with law enforcement abuse for decades have been going through. But I will say this: what they go through, what we saw happen to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, to some of these other individuals recently, that now it's become part of the public's focus, has been going on to the motorcycle club members since the 60s. I know motorcycle club members. I've been beaten by cops just because they know we don't talk. Even if it's against a dirty cop, we won't file a police report.
So explain why that is, because I know why it is, but I want you to explain why because they go, if there were good cops, they would step up, and it's not that simple. So please explain why good cops don't step up.
Because there's bad guys in the outlaw motorcycle club world that are up to criminal things, that there's a group of bad individuals in law enforcement. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the federal, state, or local level, they exist. And just like in religion, we've got bad priests and ministers, or we've got bad teachers that have committed crimes, or judges even that have committed crimes. So it doesn't matter what segment of society we're talking about. Within every segment of society, there exists bad people who intend to do harm. And you get that in law enforcement as well. And the problem with law enforcement, from my own personal experience, what I saw is, because of qualified immunity and because you have implied integrity, because you're a law enforcement officer, they're not going to listen to the other person's story. They're going to take the side of the law enforcement officers right off the bat. And it's going to be up to them to prove, that the law enforcement officer did something illegal, which never happens. And even when you can prove it, it gets covered up, And so when we're talking about the outlaw motorcycle club world, particularly, we started getting profiled, we started getting abused in 1965 with the Lynch Report. But because that was when the culture was really starting to grow and thrive, and all the guys who had started the culture were still in their, at that point, late 20s, early 30s, they were still trying to be tough guys, because they hadn't actually got a chance to be real tough guys, except for the guys that went to combat, and they came home all fucked up, so they just didn't care what they were doing. And you introduced methamphetamine in the late 60s to the motorcycle club culture, and that really creates another problem there. But with us, in the motorcycle club culture, it's always been just a few individuals, or it's been one chapter that was full of methamphetamine addicts that they were all doing the same thing together, because that's what they do. They're methamphetamine addicts. With outlaw motorcycle clubs, you've got individuals. You've got the same thing with cops. The problem is with cops, because they've got that badge and they've got that implied integrity, they operate much more overtly than the corrupt elements in those or the corrupt individuals in those other elements of society. And so if we look at things like, I guess the most prominent example would be the LA County Sheriff's Office or Sheriff's Department. They have several well-known gangs of law enforcement officers that operate out of individual precincts within the LA Sheriff's Department. So they've got groups like the Banditos and the Little Devils from a different precinct. And they're just like an outlaw motorcycle club or a criminal street gang. They're more like a criminal street gang than an outlaw motorcycle club because they're committing crimes together. Whereas in outlaw motorcycle clubs, it's just the few individual criminals who are doing that. And they do it with impunity. I mean, if you research some of these LA sheriff's gangs, they've had racist posters in their precinct rooms, and they've beaten each other up. They get their own tattoos to commemorate killing somebody on the job. I mean, it's pretty disgusting. And the FBI is actually investigating one of the LA sheriff's gangs right now called the Banditos, with a T, not with a D like motorcycle club. But we don't hear about this in the public sector because, number one, they don't want us to know, because if we knew there were gangs in law enforcement that were controlling whole neighborhoods and operating out of precincts where the entire precinct or the majority of the precinct was acting criminally and part of the criminal enterprise, we'd lose all faith in law enforcement, and we'd be screaming to defund them a long time ago, decades ago. So it's been a very well-kept secret, and it's only been recently that the media has actually started to take an interest in looking at the indiscretion by law enforcement and saying, you know what, this actually does happen. So, yeah, there are gangs in law enforcement. There's bad guys in law enforcement.
Yeah, I'm glad that it's finally come to light. There's a couple things. I was a bodyguard for several. It's been many years now. I was in business with a couple ex-Miami police detectives, and the reason why they were ex-police detectives is because they were set up to be killed because they had ratted out on a bad cop, and it's only because somebody gave them, told them secretly, don't go to this call because it's a setup.
Yes.
So both of them got out of law enforcement right then and there, and then came up into my area and started a security business. And I ran the personal bodyguard section of it. And to think that, and this is what I don't think most Americans are aware of, that you were right, that these cops, there are a bad group of cops who are willing to kill their own to protect their criminal enterprise. And I've been friends with so many cops through the years, and I've seen that they have the same. And again, I spoke to a friend of mine who's a psychologist who did psychological exams for a county, which I won't mention because I'm not sure if he's still doing them, but he would do the psychological exams for the potential police officers. And when he first started many years ago, he went to his supervisor and he goes, they have the same mindset, the same makeup as criminals. And he goes, yeah, I know, you've got to ignore that or we would never hire anybody. And they do. They have very similar mindsets as criminals have. And I know this because, again, I was a cop. My brother was a cop. I watched my brother sit there and go and give some kids a hard time because they were smoking some pot, and read them the riot act as if they had just committed a major crime, and yet this bitch was stealing, cable, and somehow, said that was okay. I don't, so yes, this kind of behavior goes on. And again, I don't think that mainstream America has been aware of it. And even now that it's becoming, to the forefront, I don't know how many of them believe it. Like, I think that, they're like, that's why it's important that people hear your story and go, look, these aren't just, singled out incidences. These happen throughout the country.
What's interesting is, with my own experience, I knew there were bad cops. As one, I have been in training with other cops, and I've heard them, break for us to head out into the field to do field training, with a chant of, all right, let's go violate some rights. I mean, yeah, that was common. I would go out at these training events. I'd go out with these other undercovers, and these guys were way more criminal than any of us were as bikers when we go out to the same types of bars. These guys would get drunk, they'd deliberately pick fights, and then they'd go get in their government cars and drive around drunk off their ass with guns on. And if they got pulled over, they'd badge their way out of it, and nobody would ever hear of it. Now, I saw this firsthand. If I had ever done that, I mean, I couldn't enjoy myself and go to a bar and have a drink, because as soon as I left the bar, we were going to get pulled over as a pack, and all of us were going to get sobriety tests, But these guys can go out when, you know, they've deconflicted, and so the law enforcement in the local area where they're training knows they're at, and they'll go out, get drunk, beat up civilians, and, you know, get in their car with their gun on and go drive around. And if they get caught, like I said, they badge their way out. Nobody ever finds out about it, and that's the end of it. Now, if you don't have a badge, I've been at trainings with special operations guys. They like to go out and get drunk too, and sometimes they get in fights. But what I see happen with them is they get a DUI and they go to jail.
Right.
You know. Now, I think they're doing, those special operators are doing a much more noble job for our country than those dirtbag undercover officers who are deliberately breaking the law when they choose to get drunk and drive around with a gun on taxpayer dollars. They're doing it all on taxpayer dollars. They're not paying that bill out of their pocket. We're paying for them to get drunk. We're paying for them to get drunk to the point that they pick a bar fight with a civilian and then breach the peace in a foreign jurisdiction where they don't have authority. I mean, but nobody says anything about it, and there's never any accountability for it. So that, I think, is a big problem. And what you'll find as you read through the books is that's what I call for, is congressional oversight and accountability on outlaw motorcycle gang investigations, because the problem is there is a criminal enterprise that is made up of law enforcement officers from the federal, state, and local level, and they're the ones that are driving outlaw motorcycle gang investigations. They're the ones that have come up with that term, outlaw motorcycle gang. And beyond that, they've created a false narrative about outlaw motorcycle clubs, claiming that they're criminal enterprises, using their ability as federal law enforcement officers to force people to take plea agreements, knowing that there's a 90% conviction rate if that individual goes to trial. So their attorney is going to tell them, don't go to trial, take whatever deal they offer you. And so I've got friends that have been convicted of federal racketeering crimes, same type of crimes that John Gotti was convicted of, right? Al Capone. But my buddies, rather than having this litany of crimes that they've committed that the prosecutors present in court and can evidence, I've got a buddy who was convicted of illegal gambling and aid of racketeering, and he had to pay a $50 fine for transporting $250 worth of raffle money his club had made from selling raffle tickets for a charity across state lines to a national meeting so that they could pile it all together as a club from all the different chapters and buy the motorcycle that they were donating to charity. You know, that's wrong. At the same time, you've got a guy like Jay Dobbins, Special Agent Jay Dobbins from the ATF, who violated ATF protocol and federal laws to go into Mexico during Operation Black Biscuit and to get Black Biscuit started. So he committed a series of criminal offenses with the knowledge of 3 or more other ATF agents and law enforcement officers, which would be a criminal conspiracy and meet racketeering standards, to launch an investigation that led to indictments against several Hells Angels. But ultimately those charges and his investigation was so corrupt and tainted, they offered him all sweetheart plea deals, and almost nobody did any jail time. And the 3 guys that did do jail time did less than 5 years, you know. But that was the biggest racketeering case against the Hells Angels in history. If you listen to Agent Dobbins and the ATF, they won't tell you, however, about all the corruption that he was involved in or that his informant were involved in. They won't tell you about the illegal wiretaps that they conducted as part of the investigation. They won't tell you about the drug use amongst the undercover agents that were involved in that, you know, because they don't want you to know that. They want you to think they just go to work, pretend to be something that they aren't, and criminals just say, oh yeah, you guys are totally believable, we'll go with you. But what happens is these guys come in and they're so over the top of their criminality and their tough guy personas, they don't seem realistic to the world, the club world. And so we're looking at them as cops from the time they get involved, and they end up having to do these crazy, what they call street theater, because that's what federal courts have accepted it as, when in reality it's entrapment. You know, and that's how they generate these charges and these indictments against club members.
There are going to be people out there and go, okay, what's the motive? Why would they do this? Why would they, you know, profile motorcycle clubs? What is it? What's their beef against motorcycle clubs or any group for that matter? Why would cops go out of the way and do these illegal things and pick on you? Like I guarantee you there's people out there thinking of that.
Okay, so to understand why motorcycle clubs, you have to understand where it came from. And I mentioned the Lynch report, which is where it started in 1965 with Attorney General Lynch from California. He was the first one to say outlaw motorcycle gangs are the bad guy. He needed re-election. On the East Coast at the time, there was a lot of talk about the mafia because the FBI was having a lot of success against the American mafia and using infiltration investigations against them and surveillance operations and whatnot. But there wasn't a bad guy on the West Coast as far as the mafia. There was really not a lot of investigations going on at the time. In '74, the ATF was started, and they had problems right from the get-go when they were started. There was a lot of problems with that agency because they had no oversight, and right from the get-go, the government wanted to shut them down and was going to shut them down. And it was 1974 out of the San Francisco office, when that office was going to get shut down along with several others. The regional director for the ATF out of the San Francisco office teamed with two undercover investigators, and they declared outlaw motorcycle gangs mafia on wheels, and because they needed a bad guy similar to the mafia that they could then launch infiltration investigations against, so they could do undercover work, because there just aren't a lot of bad guys selling machine guns and explosives and tobacco out there. And so, they needed to keep themselves busy, and outlaw motorcycle clubs gave them that bad guy, because Attorney General Lynch had already said they were just a few years earlier. And then there was another politician that came in for Attorney General right after Lynch, who ran on the same platform that Lynch did, that he was going to, stop these evil outlaw motorcycle gangs in California. And what happened with those ATF agents when they and the supervisor, when they decided in '74 that, hey, we're going to get shut down, we need to find a bad guy, let's make outlaw motorcycle gangs our bad guy, is then those two undercover agents, because they only had an operating budget of $350 for the whole investigation, those two undercover agents had to dip into their own pocket and spend their own money to buy contraband, whether it was guns or drugs or whatever. And what they did essentially is waste 2.5 months of government time and money hanging out at a motorcycle shop in California where the Hells Angels happen to hang out at. And they occasionally bought guns and a little bit of dope and maybe a stolen motorcycle part from members or associates of the Hells Angels. Eventually, ATF came into them after 2.5 months and said, you guys aren't doing anything worth a damn, so we're shutting you down. And that case never went anywhere. But what ended up happening is they used that case to justify, we need to keep investigating outlaw motorcycle gangs, and see, the FBI got some convictions out of that case. So, we need to keep focusing on outlaw motorcycle gang investigations. At that point, the ATF had their bad guy. They had some credibility because the court was buying into it and the public was buying into it, that outlaw motorcycle gangs were the bad guy. And so they spun off and planned a new infiltration investigation, and it just went from there. And those early ones were really not all that fruitful. And then in the late 90s, they realized outlaw motorcycle, they had infiltrated by then so many different clubs, and for so long, they know exactly how the outlaw motorcycle community works. They know we're not criminal organizations, and they know how to manipulate us too. And so in the 90s, ATF agent Dobbins and some others got involved in an investigation, an undercover investigation that the ATF was running against the Sons of Silence. And since they couldn't come up with any criminal activity, what they decided is they'd operate off of the fact at the time that if you start a motorcycle club in a state without getting the permission of, they call it the dominant 1% club. There's really no dominant 1% club. Well, Texas maybe in the old days, but usually there's multiple 1% clubs in the state. Nobody's going to say, oh yeah, I'm subservient to that other guy, that other club over there. So we share the state together. We can communicate equally, and we just coexist. But in the old days, in the 70s and 80s, if you started a club without getting permission, or at least saying, hey, this is what I want to do, hope you don't have a problem with it, you're going to be confronted by the 1% clubs from that area. You might be beaten up and you might have your patch taken. That's probably what would have happened back then. Today, you don't do that anymore, because now we get charged with armed robbery and native racketeering for doing that kind of stuff. So you can't do it because you'll go to prison for 25 years on a RICO beef. But that's the way it was back then. And so what the ATF did in the late 90s when their case against the Suns wasn't going anywhere is undercover agent Dobbins and some other undercover ATF agents threw on phony patches that they had made up to look like they were a real motorcycle club. They went into the bar where the Sons of Silence were hanging out, and then they talked shit to them deliberately to the point where a Sons of Silence member was honor bound to respond with a punch, because that's the way the protocol was in our culture back then. You disrespect somebody, you call them a motherfucker, they're going to sock you in the face, and you deserve it, and you should take it and understand you deserve it. I mean, to give you an example of how little I use the word motherfucker in the 22 years I was in the club world, it was so infrequent that my old service dog trained himself to be a PTSD service dog. He was a personal protection dog first, but he trained himself to be a PTSD service dog because he realized whenever I was having a PTSD freak out, I'd use the word motherfucker. And other than that, I never used it because I didn't want somebody to sock me in the mouth. You know,
Right,
I knew
yeah.
what the consequences were. And so if I used motherfucker, it was either at a bar or someplace where I wanted to get in a fight. You know, there was a reason why I was instigating, or it just didn't come out of my mouth at all. And that's the way that dog Enzo was able to identify that and key in on that as my trigger word. And yeah, so sorry.
You know, so no, that's all right.
But yeah, I mean, like, it's the undercovers and the way they run these investigations that have defined us falsely as criminal enterprises. But for their involvement, we're just a bunch of guys who like to drink, occasionally smoke some pot, and ride our motorcycles and be left alone, and are staunchly patriotic. You know, if you step on our toes and don't apologize, you're going to hear from us. And if you deliberately disrespect us, we're going to sock you in the mouth. But that's the generation we came from, and that's the way we were taught to believe. Again, it gets back to that eye for an eye thing. It's like, why not, man? I mean, if the Bible says it's okay, why shouldn't it be? You just disrespected me. We're standing here in public. I'm going to sock you in the mouth for it.
Well, that's something where you have a term that you use saying living a life of deeds and not words. And I think there's so many of us out there today who feel the same way, and we get frustrated because it's not about that anymore, and it hasn't been for a very, very long time.
I don't fit in this world anymore, man.
I think that's where the frustration comes in, and that's why you see people who go off the deep end who don't handle it properly because they're like, this isn't the way the world is supposed to be, and yet it's where we're at. And I think what law enforcement has done is that they've got all the ingredients to make the perfect storm. So they have these officers, or they have these undercover agents. They know that if they can put together some sort of big bust, that's going to help their career.
Yes.
Then you have people who need to be reelected, like the state attorney out there, you know. Yeah. So, and then you have media who's willing to be a willing participant in this because they know sensationalism sells. Right. And you have an American public who's just naive to all of this and buys into it and believes everything that's told to them. And I know this is a fact because I have met far too many people who, I mean, even to the point where I had a gentleman, his name is Dickie Steinborn. He was, I don't know if you remember him, if you ever followed professional wrestling back in the day in the 70s, WCW. But
good old days when they cut themselves with razors.
Yeah, like he has stories about Dusty Rhodes and all their brothers. He has so many stories, and he's an amazing guy. But he truly believed that if it was in print, it had to be true. They couldn't print something that was a lie. And I go, Dickie, that's not the way the world works. Yeah. You know? And so, but he staunchly believed that if it was on TV or if it was in print, it had to be true. And I think the American public as a whole buys into that. The people who've lived these very nice lives have never had to deal with anything. Right. They believe that, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. And again, you're just another example. And I think when you have these law enforcement agencies who are militarized, I'll tell you two things. One, not only are they militarized because they have enough money. When a law enforcement agency has enough money to spend to hire a lobbyist to go to the state and say we need more money, you've already got too much money.
Right. Yeah.
That we need all of these military, weapons in order to take care of our city. Bullshit. I'm
Right.
sorry, but that's complete bullshit. So and I'm sure being in your field, you see people, you've seen them, that when you provide big boys with big toys, they want to use them, and they're looking for any damn excuse to use them. And then prop that up on this. And when, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've been in the personal training business, and I've owned a few gyms throughout my life. I can tell you time that one of the places I lived, I personally had provided steroids to a huge number of cops. Now, you put cops on steroids and you give them military weapons, what the hell do you think is going to happen?
Yeah.
You're going to find a damn reason to use those things at the drop of a hat. There is no de-escalating. They don't want to de-escalate. That's no fun.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen that firsthand.
You've read my book, so you know that I was a bodybuilder. I understand.
Yes, exactly.
And I understand steroids and cops and steroids and special operations. Here's the thing. I think that the hormones, whether we're talking about growth hormone, IGF-1, steroids, anabolic, androgenic, whatever, they've got their place in those lines of work because of the wear and tear you're putting on your body. Now, does the average patrol cop need a bunch of steroids? Probably not. A SWAT guy that's banging doors every night, yeah, he might, especially after he gets up about 40. And your special operators, even in their 20s, yeah, they're going to need, because of what they're doing to their bodies, jumping out of planes, hopping in and out of helicopters, everything else they're doing. You got to keep those guys healthy. You got to allow them to repair. But the thing is, when you're a law enforcement officer, you are sworn to uphold the law. And it's very obvious when you're using steroids. Yet everyone in law enforcement looks past it like, oh, I didn't know anything about it.
Right.
Imagine that. I mean, we had an incident here, and this is a great example. It was, I believe, 2016, 2015. He was a former professional bodybuilder named Darian Hollywell, who got on with the King County Sheriff's Department here in Seattle, became SWAT commander, and then decided to start selling steroids to every agency in King County, and law enforcement agency. Then he started selling ecstasy and MDMA and pimping his wife out, and got busted for doing all of that, including stealing ammunition and brass from the range that he was supervisor of with the Sheriff's Department. This guy did less than a year in jail for what he did, and walked away with a minor felony. His life wasn't ruined. If that had been me, I would have done 25 years to life over what he did. It would have been a racketeering crime. And all of those cops that were involved, that he had text messages showing the deals between these cops. And when they were interviewed, they admitted to buying steroids and other drugs from him illegally. Nothing happened to them. Nothing happened to them.
Well,
they got a letter of reprimand and told that they couldn't do steroids anymore. And that was it.
And here's the thing.
But that's the double standard that we have for law enforcement, because in law enforcement, we don't want the public to lose faith. So we don't want you to know what shitbags there are in law enforcement. And it's not all of them by any means. Right. But there's enough. And there's such serious shitbags. We need to pay attention to it. I mean, for Christ's sakes, the cellmate of Jeffrey Epstein when he was murdered was a New York cop who was there for doing 4 murders. I mean, not all cops are nice guys. And that's genuine proof right there.
Well, I'll tell you this. You hit on so many points. Yes. First off, and I know you and I both agree on this, there are a lot of great cops out there. And
yes, there are.
And I will tell you firsthand experience that it's unfortunate. I see these cadets come out of their training, and they come into their wherever they're assigned, and there's this culture there that's cultivated, and it's automatic. It's them against us, and it starts becoming ingrained in you because that's what you're taught, and that's what the other officers say. That's why you don't cross that blue line. You always stick up for for your partner, and if you don't, then you're a snitch. And and so even the best of the best, the people who go in there for the right reasons, I find that their mentality changes, and I feel bad because I know these are good people, but in order for them to be able to operate within that culture, they have to buy into that. And there's only two reasons that that I can think of that happens. And I've said this many times: bad cops can't exist unless there are bad leaders.
Right.
So if you get rid of the bad leaders and also the police union, because the police union becomes so powerful that they even when you have good leaders and they try to get rid of these bad cops, they get hired on somewhere else, or they get or they have to let them back on. And so there has to be a change there. There just has to be, and there has to be accountability. That if you have leaders who are allowing bad cops to run as wildly as they have, and you find that there are good cops who've reported it, and those good cops have ended up having to leave because of the treatment they got, there has to be some sort of accountability there in order for this to change. For good cops to be able to come forward and know that they're not just going to lose their job, but also not put their life at risk or their family's life at risk for simply doing the right thing. And the other thing I wanted to make a point of is, like, you're right. There's, this is overlooked. This whole steroid thing was overlooked, even though the state attorney out in California back in the 80s tried to equate steroids as being worse than cocaine.
Right.
And I know because I had a friend who ended up, who was, I guess you could say, a business partner of mine, who ended up going to jail for 2 years off of just, what little they had on him, because you probably know he was a very famous powerlifter, Larry Pacifico, acted like a little bitch and just snitched on everybody because he didn't want to get any time. Anyway, this nationwide hunt went on, and a lot of people got busted because of it, and a lot of it was just bullshit, like you said, and that's what it usually is. They just they prop up all these bullshit charges, and it's like, okay, if you lose though, you're going to get 25 years, so take the plea bargain. And people are scared shitless. Who wants to take a chance of spending 25 years in a federal prison because the people who are sitting in those seats there who are going to make that judgment don't know shit, and they're going to believe the police department.
Right. So I have to compare and contrast. We talked about the cops. They got busted, caught with the dope on them, nothing happened. I've got a friend who is from another 1% motorcycle club, and his club was under investigation because he was an officer in the club. Automatically, you become a target of the investigation, whether you're up to anything or not. They assume you are because you're an officer, and they assume it's like the mafia, everything has to get cleared, which it's not. But he was busted for 25 D-ball pills in a blister pack and a half bottle of testosterone. And they charged him a felony count for every one of those D-ball pills. And then they charged him it was 200 milligram testosterone. And the doctor they put on the stand for the prosecution said, yeah, I would only probably prescribe him about 50 milligrams a month. And so then they broke down that half a vial of testosterone into individual doses based on that 50 milligram recommendation and charged him with felonies for each of those. So he's facing like 60 felonies, for those two little bits of contraband. Yet in this other case, they had all sorts of evidence, all sorts of drugs that they found at these guys' house, and nothing happened to them. Not a racketeering charge, and certainly not, over a dozen of them, over 50 of them. Right. It was crazy.
Well, don't you find it funny though? Nowadays, now you actually have these testosterone, clinics. It's like, wait a minute.
Greatest thing in the world, I think.
Exactly. And again, I'm sure you and I both agree. I have no issues with steroids at all. I know that's been blown out of proportion, and that
they can be used safely.
Right. They can be. And, and the doctors that spoke up back in the 80s didn't know shit about steroids. They were talking out their ass, and they were just going along with what everybody was told, and that's the unfortunate thing, is that when we have people in leadership, positions or authoritative positions, and they lie, it makes it that much harder for when we have people who, like today with the coronavirus, that
Right.
people are going, well, I don't believe him, but and you kind of understand why. Fauci's sitting up there and saying, you need to wear a mask. That's what we need to do. And you have a segment of society going, oh, fuck him. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
Well, it's because they've been lied to so much that when you finally tell the truth, people, it's like, the boy who cried wolf too many times.
Right. What do you believe?
Right, exactly. So, I understand it. I don't agree with them, but I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's, it's just a totally different standard for the normal segment of society. And if you're in a marginalized segment of society, like, some of the minorities or an outlaw motorcycle club member, man, you're screwed, because they're coming after you. They're going to blame stuff on you that you didn't do. And you're going to take a hit that you don't deserve.
You said you were beaten by cops too. Was this while you were a cop?
Yeah. Well, I've been beaten numerous times by cops over the years. The first time was when I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I was in college, and I was working for a nightclub that happened to be owned by a mobster who was on the run. And I didn't know any of his business. I just knew I worked at his nightclub. And anyway, they scooped me up one night. I was driving home, and the cops grabbed me. Pulled me over for speeding. Next thing I know, I'm handcuffed and in the back of a cop car. I'm being driven out to a farmer's field and beaten. That was the first time. Second time, there's been a lot of times, but the most significant one for me happened when I was on duty working undercover, and after I had produced my credentials and identified myself. And I was in a state undercover vehicle that was clearly an undercover vehicle, because our entire unit's vehicles were all registered to Star Wars characters at the exact same address. Because if we got some, nobody beat cop showing up where we're doing surveillance or we're doing, whatever we're doing, and they run our plate, we want them to know right away it's an undercover vehicle and to back off, and anybody worth 2 cents is going to figure out that Darth Vader doesn't actually own a car in Ballard, Washington,
Right.
but, or Luke Skywalker. I mean, that's how overt these things were. They were cold plated, but we wanted to let other law enforcement know, hey, back off, deconflict. That time was a bad situation, and they handcuffed me, they beat me. I was actually released to my boss, and they told him, oh, if we had better credentials, it would have never happened. Bullshit.
Yeah, the fact that would happen to anyone is you're right. It's complete bullshit. It should never happen to anybody.
And you'll understand this because you understand the business, the profession. I had opened up my Nextel as soon as they started the felony stop and all the guns came out, and got my boss on the line, told him where I'm at, and said, hey, you need to get here now. And it was interesting because after it was all done, he was so upset about the whole incident. He's like, we're going to go after him. We're going to hold that agency accountable. Fuck them. And when we got the radio traffic, you hear a cop, after it had been going on for 30 minutes or more, you hear him radio in and saying, hey, I'm free now. You guys still need me over there? He's like, well, we don't need anything, but you're going to want to get over here and get in on this. Give me a call on my Nextel, and I'll tell you what it's all about.
Wow.
The reason he wanted to call on his Nextel is because that's not recorded, but all that radio traffic is.
Right.
So they can't tell you we got Twitch hemmed up and we're beating the hell out of them on the side of the road. You should come have fun, unless they do it on the Nextel where nobody can hear about it. But when we got the audio recording of the radio traffic, it was clear. That's what they were doing. They were calling in friends to come join the party, and they didn't want it recorded. And so they diverted all the traffic to the Nextel.
So we've done a great job, I think, of pointing out, all the problems with the police department, with the profiling that they do with the motorcycle clubs, what they do with minorities and even low income people, even low income whites, and anybody that they feel like they want to punish, they will do so at their own discretion. So I'm all about finding solutions. What is the solution? Is defunding the police department a solution? And if so, to what extent?
I don't believe defunding. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last several months. I don't think defunding the police department is the right answer. They need money to do their job, and they need equipment, they need training, they need all sorts of things. and it all takes money. But I think the biggest problem is how the money is being spent. You mentioned the weaponry. There is no reason why my little town that I live in that has, I mean, it's a tiny little town. We don't need an armored Bearcat, but we've got one. It sits there in the parking lot day in, day out. I don't think they ever take it out except for trainings. I've never seen it on a warrant, but we've got one. We don't need one. I mean, and I think having that and training guys to operate on it and training guys to deploy out of it, because you have to do all that if you're going to have it in your inventory. Like you said, it encourages those guys to want to go use that new toy. And that encourages them to use it, or that results in them using it in instances where they really shouldn't.
Right.
The application or the deployment wasn't appropriate. And so I think what we need is not to defund the police, but there needs to be a civilian and congressional review board that's totally independent of law enforcement, that sits at an oversight level, whether it's, you know, broken up to local, state, and federal oversight boards, or just one federal oversight board that covers, you know, every level of agency. But they need to approve how warrants are going to be served, and whether it can be a no-knock warrant, or whether you can deploy a Bearcat, or whether you can go drop 4 snipers on different houses in the you know, residential neighborhood, because you're going to go make an arrest. Or how we're going to, you know, make entry. I mean, some of these dynamic entries we're doing on warrants now, when you look at the threat assessment, they'll justify it saying officer safety. But those of us who have done a lot of direct action stuff and do threat assessments all the time will say, no, that's overkill. You don't need that, you know? So I think that there needs to be, like I said, that independent citizen and congressional review board that can look at how they're spending their money. If the money that's coming in is necessary, we need to stop allowing DHS to say, okay, we've got this huge budget that we're not using, so your agency gets a Humvee and your agency gets a Bearcat and you guys get a tank, you know, or you guys get, you know, brand new machine guns. That needs to be curtailed as well, because that's how we've been militarizing the police so quickly, is under the Patriot Act, under Homeland Security, and under these various Homeland Security grants that aren't being used. So if we can put that review board in place to not only look at misconduct, not only look at budgetary issues, excuse me, but also look at training issues and everything else, I think we can move forward. We can start to see reform. But if we allow the police unions to stay as strong as they are, which is they're basically a mafia with a stranglehold on every aspect related to oversight on law enforcement. I mean, it's crazy how effective they are. I mean, if we allow them to stay in control, if we allow these police agencies to operate with gangs within them, like we talked about earlier with the LA Sheriff's Department, and even when they're investigated those types of things and that culture, even whether or not there was crime there, that culture of putting racist things in your patrol room, you know, and having tattoos put on every time you kill or shoot a suspect. If we don't curtail those kind of things, we're not going to see any reform. Defunding the police doesn't matter. Because we're still going to have a bunch of criminals in the police. They're just going to have less money, which is going to make them more criminal. So I think we need to really be careful with how we move forward here. I think we need to not approach it from a standpoint of emotion and passion. I think those are okay things to bring into it, but I think our primary focus needs to be safety, security, accountability, and reform. Because without those, these types of incidents, like what we've been seeing, and like what I saw in the Outlaw Motorcycle Club world, they'll continue to happen in perpetuity, and we'll never see any change. And if we continue down this road of defunding the police, we're going to see things get worse. I mean, who are we supposed to call? What you're encouraging is what we see overseas, and you're going to create a bunch of tribal warlords amongst those of us that have the skill set and the mentality and the strength to be the strong ones in the communities and protect ourselves, and we'll start farming ourselves out to protect the people around us that need help. Right. You know, and that's how warlords are created. That's how chaos and anarchy results. And that's how nations are overthrown.
I would have to, I would have to say I agree with you. I think defunding the police department is a bad idea. I think reallocating the money that they have and
Yes.
where it goes is a much better way of handling it. I also, you know, there's a couple things. I want to get your opinion on this. I personally believe that the beat cop doesn't need a gun. I just don't believe they need one. And here's why. I believe that we should have, just like we have SWAT teams, I believe we should have teams that if a weapon is, at a scene, that team is called. But your regular beat cop who's out on the street, they're more likely to want to handle things and de-escalate things than to escalate it when they don't have that weapon of death strapped to their hip that they can use at a second's notice. And that's right. And I think that's what happens, is that a lot of times these cops, and we've seen it over and over again, you cannot watch YouTube and not see this happen over and over again, where innocent people are shot dead and they're not even doing anything except for exactly what the cop told them to do, and they still got shot. And and I always, and you brought up the point that you said, officer safety, that's what they always go with. I'm going, look, having been one, I remember a guy pulled a knife out on us one time at a scene. Not one of us even thought about pulling our weapon because we knew he was of no threat, because he just wasn't. If it had escalated, maybe then we would have thought about it, but it hadn't. He just had it in his hand. Why am I going to cause even more stress to this guy by pulling my gun out and pointing it at him when I can just simply say, sir, you need to drop the knife? Why do I need to pull a gun on him when he's a good 10, 15 feet away from me to make that point? He's not going to charge me so fast unless he, is Bo Jackson. He's not going to get to me that fast before I could pull my weapon and fire it. And yet these cops always use that excuse, that they, fear for their life. If you're that chicken shit, you don't belong on the police department, and you're not there to serve the safety of the officers there. You're there to serve the safety of the community. And if you're not putting their lives first and you're putting your lives first, to me, you're not doing your fucking job. And I'm sorry, but you go into that job, like you said, you go into the Hells Angels knowing what the rules are. Well, you go becoming a police officer knowing what the rules are, and yet you've changed those damn rules to fit you and worry about your safety. I want police officers to be safe, as safe as they can be, but I also want the rest of the community that they're supposed to serve to be just as safe, if not safer.
Right. One of the things when it comes to the beat cop and firearms, I think about their training and their qualifications. Most departments, the budget isn't there to allow these police officers to train with their firearm on a regular basis, and they're only required to qualify quarterly. And you're talking about handing a person a gun and sending them out every day for their profession, where they may or may not have to use lethal force depending on who they encounter and what happens. And they're really not all that well trained with a firearm to go ahead and deploy that weapon. I mean, I look at their shooting qualification standards, and I think that's what we should have for anybody who wants to carry a gun in Washington State concealed. I mean, there should be a minimum level of standard of training, and that should be it. But really, that level of training is not appropriate in my mind, even for a civilian. But that should be the base minimum, and then from there, if you're going to be a police officer, absolutely, you need to be able to shoot very, very well, and you should train all the time with it. But I look at my county in particular, we've got a SWAT team, but those guys, they get like $100 a month in ammunition to train with, and that's nothing. How are you supposed to feel competent with a weapon when you're getting $100 in ammunition a month to train in? And that's up from what they were getting. It used to be $100 for the entire unit. I don't know how and those are the guys operating on the highest level. So if they're operating on the highest level, what's the beat cop getting to train with every month? That's coming out of his own pocket, I bet. And how much when you're a cop? I mean, I don't know what it was like where you're at, but when I was working here in Washington, we were making a little over 50 grand a year, and that was it. Right. It's not like I'm an ATF agent making 200 grand a year.
Don't you think a lot of it has to do with situational things as well. Like for instance, if you get a B cop who's, he's on the street every day, and and it's pretty much mundane throughout, and then all of a sudden there's something that happens, something that gets escalated. Now, it may not even be anything major, but to him it's major because he hasn't seen any, action for months on end, and all of a sudden, his adrenaline starts going, and and he feels, and he's scared because he hasn't encountered this in a long time. I've done martial arts and wrestling and boxing for years and years. And I'll tell you, even with the number of years that I've done it, if I don't do it consistently, then what will happen is, like, when I do it consistently, you and I could square up and I'm not going to be nervous, not even one bit. I don't care about getting hit in the face because I've been hit in the face so many times before. It doesn't matter.
Right.
But let me take some time off and not get hit in the face for a while. And all of a sudden, like, holy shit, this guy's going to hit me in the face, because you forget about all that training. So I just feel like when you put people in a situation where they haven't, they don't deal with this on a daily basis, and all of a sudden they're confronted with it, that's why we see so many mistakes by police officers, and we see them do it. Maybe we think it's ridiculous, but they act outside the boundaries of what we would consider normal. And
So, I think that you mentioned something very valuable there. If you've got a skill and you don't train it, you will lose it, no matter what it is. And when these law enforcement officers are, depending their lives on their skill set, and consequently, whenever they have to execute and use their skill set, the citizens around them are counting on their skill set being very, very refined, because there's a lot of bad things that can go on. When you don't train something, you'll lose that skill, and that's unacceptable in law enforcement. I realized this myself yesterday, actually. I spend all my time training dogs and training myself physically and training with firearms and doing other things. I don't spend a lot of time anymore writing by hand. I just got done writing 3 books, not by hand. And I was out getting a haircut yesterday and ran into a woman who actually had a copy of my first book on her. And she's like, "Oh, will you sign it for me?" It's the first book I've signed. The books only came out 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I've been hiding out in the mountains, and this was the first one I was signed. I was really honored. And I went to write by hand. And aside from signing my name, which is pretty much the only thing I do anymore by hand, as far as writing, my handwriting was garbage. Just trying to figure out how to formulate and make the words come out on the page was nuts. And it hit me right then. I'm like, man, I've been spending all of my time doing what I enjoy and practicing and refining those skill sets to such a high level. I've let my writing go, something super simple that you take for granted. My handwriting has gone to crap. And so I need to start practicing that now, because it's a skill set we need in our lives. Now, maybe not all the time, but with what I'm doing now, I absolutely have to be able to write by hand. Right. So, with these cops, when they lose the firearm skills or the combative skills or the weapons retention skills or whatever it is, it's a big problem, because not only does it negatively impact their work, it puts people's lives at risk, whether it's theirs or the people around them. And, that's why I think that maybe spending more money on training and the things we need for these officers to be able to train on a regular basis, and less money on Bearcats or exploding body armor or any of the other weird crap that they've got that they really don't need. Because there's other agencies that have that stuff too, that are supposed to be fighting the bad guys that need that stuff first. So I don't think our local agencies need that kind of stuff.
I agree, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that we need to put a hell of a lot more focus on training, not just after they get out of school, because the school is only 6 months.
Right.
I mean, and someone made the point a couple of weeks ago. They said, it takes, I think it was a year, I think they said, to become a cosmetologist.
Right.
And yet to become a cop, it takes 6 months, and you're going to have a gun strapped to your hip. That's ridiculous. And someone asked me one time, they said, did you learn how to fight when you were going through the academy? I go, they only teach you enough to get yourself hurt. That's what they teach you. They don't, seriously, it's lacking so much. And when we look at police departments, where are some of the best police departments in the world, like we take Germany, for instance, they're training, they go through school for 2 years, to become a cop. And and if we sit there and go, well, people aren't going to, they're not going to train that long to become a cop, then they don't belong as a cop. If they're not going into it for the right reason, we don't need them. Those are the people that are killing innocent civilians and citizens. They're the ones who are causing all the problems that we're seeing.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that we can look at a lot of the European agencies, law enforcement agencies, and go, why aren't we more like that?
Right.
You look at like the Belgian DSU, it's their primary law enforcement counterterrorism unit there. Those guys are known for being incredibly, good at what they do, but they don't kill a lot of people when they do it. It's very rare that they'll actually execute and use force. They overwhelm, and
right.
they will. There's definitely violence of action, but they don't pull the trigger a whole lot unless they absolutely have to. And they show a lot of restraint in situations where here in America we just go and take all the bad guys out.
So you make a great point right there, and that's what I think the difference is that these other countries, they show a lot of restraint. We don't. You take the ATF, and you just take the incident in Waco, for instance. They didn't. There was one person who wanted to show restraint, who was the negotiator.
Right. Yeah.
The rest of them were like, let's go in there because my guys have been out here for 30 days or whatever it was.
Right.
And, it's time to end this.
Time to end this.
Why is it time? This is your job, and yet you're willing to take a risk of killing innocent people and then changing and making a false narrative as if they killed themselves or all this other bullshit that they tried to put out there as their propaganda to cover their asses. And it shows that because here's what happens, just like with the motorcycle gangs, with minorities, with poor people, they don't just want to serve justice. They want to make sure we're better than you. You better stay in line because we're gonna knock you on your ass. And I have zero doubt that is the message that they're sending when they sit there and when they sit their knee on a black man's head. They're showing the black community, see, you're beneath us, and we'll fuck with you, and we'll do whatever the hell we want, and you're going to put up with it. And they know, and I know you experienced that with the motorcycle clubs as well.
Yeah, it's about extrajudicial punishment. They want to punish you for being who you are because they know they don't have any criminal activity they can punish you for. So they'll inflict physical punishment, and
because they want to send.
Cases, they'll entrap you.
I think they want to send a message of intimidation to everyone.
That
we can do this and we will do this, and that's all it is. It's an intimidation tactic that police departments throughout this country have used, again, on minorities, on motorcycle clubs, on those who are economically less advantaged. You don't see them doing this to rich white people.
No.
They don't do that shit to rich white people because they know rich white people know people who will make phone calls and get their job, get them fired or charged or whatever. But they have no problem doing this to those who are less fortunate.
They look for disadvantaged to take advantage. And so, like, I referenced the Hells Angel RICO case here in Washington back in 2006, the one that Josh got convicted in. And what's interesting about that case is in that case, the government made it clear from some of the documents that they filed that they plan to try and take the Hells Angels trademark from them. Well, the Hells Angels are known as the most sophisticated outlaw motorcycle club in the world. They've been around for such a long time, and they got their game together. They've got attorneys that they'll use to defend their trademark and defending criminal cases and whatnot. And so when it comes to taking their trademark, it makes them a very formidable adversary because they've defended their trademark numerous times successfully against all sorts of different litigants. And what happened was, at the same time Josh's RICO was going on and the Angels RICO here in Washington was going on, the feds were also running Operation Black Rain against the Mongols down in California. And they had 12 undercover ATF agents and a bunch of contract sources of information undercover in the Mongols at that time. They were entrapping people left and right. And the Mongols at that time had brought in a lot of Serrano gang members that were up to their own crimes because they were Serrano gang members and not Mongols, really. And what ended up happening is, because the Mongols were an easier target because they've never had to defend their trademark, the feds don't think they have as much money as the Angels. Feds think the Angels are rich as hell. They're not. In fact, you talk to an Angel and they'll tell you how poor that club is. But the feds like to claim that they're rich, and the Mongols have never been looked at that way. And so what the feds did is, even though they got convictions in Josh's case, rather than pursue the trademark, they waited until Operation Black Rain against the Mongols came to a close. And then they pursued seizing the Mongols trademark, because they were an easier target. They viewed them as disadvantaged, less sophisticated, less financial resources. And so they were an easier victim to try and take their trademark. And what happened is, even though that case was closed out in 2008, the feds kept appealing the case and refiled it a couple of different times to try and take the Mongols trademark. And finally, in 2018, the case, even though the convictions were from 2008, the case against the Mongols as an entire organization, where the feds were trying to take their trademark, went to trial. And ultimately, the feds were successful. But I was there. I watched the trial. Not all of it, because it ran for 3 months, but I watched a good portion of it. I watched a lot of the prosecution's case. And what it boiled down to is the prosecution selling a jury that was mostly over 40. None of them looked like they had ever done anything motorcycle related. And they all looked like they came from a fairly privileged background. And the feds used the plea agreements from the 2008 cases and a couple of videos of some fights that occurred in the last couple of years to sell this jury that the Mongols were continuing to operate as a criminal enterprise, and the entire organization needed to be found guilty of racketeering and have their trademark, their patch, their logos seized, and anything with it on it seized, because it was a tool of intimidation used to further the criminal enterprise. That's all bullshit, but they were able to sell it to a jury, and here we are, and now the Mongols have had their. What happened was that ultimately the judge said, "Hey, we got some First Amendment issues we got to work out with the seizing the trademark," but the entire club's going on federal probation. So now that's what you've got. Guys that were never actually convicted of a crime or even in the Mongols at the time are on federal probation, which interferes with their ability to own firearms. And, it brings up a whole nother mess of questions. And so the Mongols are appealing that case. I don't know how many millions of dollars they've spent defending against it. The feds have spent over $12 million prosecuting it. So
yeah, that's another, misservice of justice, that when you have somebody that can spend unlimited amount of money,
right,
on something and not have to be accountable for it, and just go, yeah, we'll keep going, taking you to court on this until you either, we either win or you end up going broke and can't defend it any longer.
Well, and a lot of people will say, well, why did you sign a plea if you weren't guilty of anything?
Right.
And my response to that, having known these men, some I call brother, who signed these plea agreements stating they committed RICO crimes on behalf of their club, it's because they've been sitting in jail for 18 months after their house had been raided, had hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage done to it with flashbangs and just vandalism from the cops, because they go in there and they destroy your house. Extrajudicial punishment again, because what are we going to say? Oh, they did this. Nobody's going to care. Right. We'll bring it up, but they don't care. I mean, you read in my book about how the ATF agents, when they seized a motorcycle in the Sons of Silence investigation, scratched ATF in the paint. This guy's custom bike. It's all done to punish us, and that's the thing that we can't overcome. Is they can do whatever they want to us, and we can't do anything back, because nobody wants to listen to us. Nobody wants to believe us. And then when they entrap you in one of these bullshit indictments that you had nothing to do with, and you've sat for a year and a half and lost your job, lost your family, lost everything in your life, and they come to you and they say, hey man, we know that we only caught you with an eighth of weed and you just gave it to another guy in the club, so you didn't have to ride home with it. But you're going to do 25 years unless you take this plea for possession and aid of racketeering and pay, a $300 fine and do 2 years probation. What are you going to do? Are you going to take that plea, or are you going to sit and go to trial on a federal RICO case that the feds have a 90% conviction rate, and then go to prison for 25 years for something you didn't do? Of course you're going to sign that. And the feds are the ones that write the statement of facts for your plea. And they're the ones that write in there that you committed specifically, that you committed the crime in aid of the criminal enterprise and to further the criminal enterprise, and you admit that X motorcycle club is an organized crime. And that's the way they lock you in. And once they've locked you in with your statement of facts, before you can sign, you have to sign everything under penalty of perjury. And so when you sign that under penalty of perjury, now that's locked in your silence. Because if you ever say they coerced me into signing this plea agreement for something I didn't do, then boom, federal perjury, and you're off to the pen for federal perjury. And so part of the reason I wrote my book goes back to the question you asked me a little bit earlier. What would I tell somebody that wants to join an outlaw motorcycle club in this day and age? Read my books. You won't want to do it because it's all a lie. It's all an illusion now. And it's a big spy game because the feds are so evil with how they target us that you don't want to get involved in that. There's no brotherhood because you're constantly trying to save your ass from doing nothing wrong. So that's today.
I wanted to ask you something because you got out after your friend Josh got out. And you said in your book that the Brotherhood's a lie, that in any organization, that the Brotherhood is a lie. So, I happen to agree with you. There's a few people who believe in that, but the majority of people are full of shit.
Right. Yeah.
So, explain what you mean by that. I mean, I know.
The Brotherhood's a lie?
Yeah.
It's all an idea. We all talk about, I'll die for my brother. I'll go to prison for my brother. And back in the day when Josh and I got involved, you had to be that way. That's what the culture demanded, and that's the level of commitment. That's why, guys like he and I did the things that we've done, because we believe that strongly in the culture. We believe that strongly in the brotherhood. But what we saw from our time in the club world, whether it was his time or my time, which was much more extended, is everybody is all out for them, or not everybody, but the vast majority. You'll have one or two guys in a club. If you're lucky, you'll have more than one, but generally there's only one that's like me, that's just that hardcore purist. I referred to myself as a jihadi outsider because I was so focused on, doing everything to be the best 1%er, the best outsider I could possibly be, and be this ultimate representation of what a 1%er should be, and all about loyalty, honor, respect, and brotherhood. That I was fanatical about it. And I realized after I got out and had some time to analyze why I was the way I was, it's all viral mimetic infection. You get sold this idea that hey, if you're loyal and you're honorable and you're a brother, everybody will be there for you no matter what's going on in your life. You ever need anybody, they're there for you. And if the club ever needs you, you need to be there for them. And if you do anything to fuck that up, there's going to be extreme consequences, and so it really is viral mimetic infection. And the longer you're exposed to that, the longer you live that life, the more extremist you become about it, because you've been doing it so long that that's who you are. That's your representation to society. Oh, Jeff's all about this, or Josh is all about this. I could name a bunch of guys from different clubs that when I thought of their club, I thought of them because they were the ultimate representation of their club. They were out there doing it at the highest level, and they weren't just some tough guy who was trying to pretend he was tough, or being a bar brawler. They really lived the life. But what happens is, the longer you're in, what you see is when you've got guys like me, or guys like Double D, or guys like Josh, or it doesn't matter what club you're from or who you were, you will become a target by those other brothers in your club because they don't have the community recognition and the community respect that you're getting, whether it's on the local level or it's on the national and international level, like it was with me when I was in the club. So that creates jealousy, that creates friction, that creates cliques within the clubs, and guys are constantly arguing with each other and fighting with each other, and there's constantly drama. Some guys will try and get other guys kicked out of the club. It's ridiculous. I dealt with that myself. They kept trying to kick me out for years. The Portland chapter did, because they didn't like how famous I had gotten, because they wanted to think of themselves as the famous ones. I was like, well, go out and do something. Leave fucking Portland and quit being a bunch of tweakers and try and protect the culture and change the world, and people might respect you. You just can't demand respect. Oh, I'm a tough guy. Well, fuck that. That only gets you so far. you know, and it's about what you do. It's, like I said, it's deeds, not words. That's a phrase that I've got it tattooed in Latin around my neck. It's how I've lived my life, and it's how I've forced myself to push myself past my limits when I was scared.
I have to, I wish there were more people like you, because I completely agree with that. And it's unfortunate our society has gotten to a point where deeds mean nothing, and it's all about words. It's all about, like you said, there's too many people out there who feel like, that you should respect them, even though they've done nothing to be respected. The same thing with people and their opinions. They think that their opinion should be respected. And it's like, just because you have an opinion doesn't mean it deserves respect, especially when it's based off of bullshit. Yeah. So, but we do have a number of people out there who feel this way, and it's not just people want to always blame it on this generation. It's like, no, it's not. I see people in our generation who are doing the same bullshit, So it's not just a generational thing where it's just one generation who feels this way. It's goes across all generations.
I've got a good brother who's 28 years old, and he spent a long time in special operations, and he looks at the world identical to me, but there's a big generation gap there. But he's about the only person I know in his age group who thinks like he does, that's not either coming from the same background that he came from or the one that I came from. And that's kind of sad to me, that those types of Americans, those because that's what we're all about, man. That's what we're founded on, is standing up for what you believe, no matter what. And we just don't do that anymore. No, it's all about, let's talk a good game. Well, let's give a bunch of misinformation and deflect blame on somebody else, rather than saying, you know what, I fucked up. Hold me accountable, and let's move on. Because people are people. We fuck up, but people.
Nobody wants to admit it. You're right.
Nobody wants to do that,
No one
it's
takes,
like,
they don't.
When I fuck up, you've seen it in the book. Hey, I'll take my lumps, because it is what it is. I mean, that's part of being a man. And I don't want to use that term anymore, because, there's a lot of women who are just as competent and brave.
Oh yeah,
stand up for themselves. So, but it's part of being a person of integrity and character.
Yeah,
and we just don't have that. We got a bunch of whiny. I mean, like, everybody wants to blame everybody else. I don't understand how we got so partisan in this country that we can't function anymore. I mean, that's ridiculous to me. To me, everything should be so simple, because the Constitution is there. That's our guidebook. That's our operator's manual. And it's not up for a lot of ridiculous interpretation. Some of the ways we're interpreting this, or some of the things I'm seeing get appealed to our highest courts to debate, are issues that should never be brought up in front of the court, because the foundation is so un-American in its idea that it's ridiculous we're having to waste the court's time to argue it. But hey, like you mentioned earlier, people want to believe what they want to believe, and they want to believe what they read. And so that's what's allowed us to get so far off track and so askew that now we're wasting the court's time to discuss whether shall means shall, or shall means for everybody else except for you.
Right.
So it's unfortunate. I don't know how we're going to turn things back, because when I look at it, what we need here in America is we need quality leadership. And that's not going to come from somebody who spent their time in a classroom their entire life. That's got to come from somebody who's actually led and been out there in the world. And I'm not saying you have to have been in the military, but you have to have ventured outside of America and seen how the rest of the world lives, so that you understand how important our Constitution is and how we're supposed to live.
Well, I think that, we like you said, as a people, we don't accept responsibility. We want to put the blame off on everyone else. And I like to say this: if you don't like the leaders that we have in Congress, if you don't like the president we have, that's on you. Yeah. Your leaders are representing us, and that means they're an extension of us. So the people who are in office are there because that's who we are, whether we want to admit it or not. That's who we are. When we believe so so adamantly that our belief system is the only one that matters and the only one that counts, and we put people in the office who act out on that because that's what we want, then how can we be upset with the fact that they're doing exactly what we ourselves would do? If we have a president who's a liar, who is a con man, guess what? You need to look in the mirror and go, who the fuck put him there? So why do you think you put him there? Because that's who you are. Now, I know there are going to be people out there who sit there and go, well, that's not me. I didn't vote for him. I don't care. Both parties are corrupt, and I can pull names out of both parties where these people are corrupt, and that's why nothing's going to change. And so, again, it's just a matter of who you voted for, but they're the same. They're two peas in a pod. McConnell and Pelosi are two peas in a pod.
Right. We've allowed ourselves to get off track because everybody's got an agenda, and it all comes back to money and careerism and not the Constitution in America. If we want to make America great again, we need somebody like Mattis or Admiral McRaven that can be at the helm, that understands what the world's really all about and what America's really been up to all over the globe. Because when you go out and you're part of it, you see it, holy crap, man, it'll blow your mind, and some of the things that we've been lied to about as Americans, and we just take it for fact because we don't know what's going on in these far off regions other than what's reported to us, has really allowed us to unfortunately be misled about some really, really great cultures.
Yes.
And like after I left the club and I could take control of my life again and finally do what I wanted to do and not have to get it cleared through the club or worry about what my obligations were to the club or the motorcycle club community, I started to live my life again. And one of the first places I went was to Cuba. I wanted to go see Cuba and find out what it was really all about. And I'm not talking step off a cruise ship and check out, Havana for an hour or two. I went to Cuba and I spent a good deal of time there. And I spent time with 11 different Cuban families. I met one of the mafia bosses in Cuba, which their mafia is totally different than ours. And I met the president of the first motorcycle club in Cuba. Because he had been able to pirate an episode of Sons of Anarchy off of Mexican television. And when they went through the mob boss that I was in town, which you can't miss the American who's tattooed. And at the time I was very, very muscular and tan. And you're not going to miss that guy. Cuba's got some great intelligence. They were following me the entire time I was on the ground. I knew it. They were monitoring my cell phone and everything else. Anyway, the community had started in Havana, had started to refer to me as the American, because with the exception of the guys that were at Gitmo or the guys that were at the airport on their way home from Gitmo, I was the only American in town. And then you had a few people at the embassy, but it was during the Sonic attacks, so they were getting sent out back to America, or the alleged Sonic attacks.
Right.
Turned out to be garbage. But what I found out from spending time on the ground with those people and getting to know Cuban culture through the Cubans is we've been totally lied to as Americans. They don't hate Cuba. They love being there. And they don't hate the fact that they're a socialist Marxist country. That's way better than what they were dealing with under Batista.
Right.
And they've got, because they unified as a bunch of poor people and farmers, and Che just happened to be the conduit to teach them to read and to give them the confidence to do that and give them some military training. And then they went over through Batista, and Che went off and did whatever he did, which, hey, they're Cuban, so they don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. So they don't know he's a bad guy. They embrace being communists, and it works for them. And they all have side hustles that make them plenty of money. That's why a lot of them walk around with $3,000 watches on. It's because they got their side hustle, and it's all related to the tourism industry. But when you talk to them, they don't understand why we put the embargoes in place against them, why we still have them in place, and they really wish they'd go away so that they could stop having to deal with the Chinese and the Russians and the Koreans. They want to deal, with mainstream countries. They want to have trade, and they want to be just left alone and protect their culture. And so I agree with all of that. Now, do I support communism? Fuck no, I don't. It would not work here for us. But for them on that tiny little island, it's working all right, and so we shouldn't interfere with that and say, you can't be friends with us, you can't conduct trade with us, we're going to make sure you stay poor, and our travelers can't go there, which honestly, I kind of like that because it's retained a lot of their history and culture.
Right.
You haven't had a bunch of drunk Americans ruining everything and making it like Hawaii. So, but I was so disgusted when I came home from that trip, being an American who's been taught all his life that the Cubans are evil and they don't love communism, they hate it, and they're being oppressed. And Elian Gonzalez wants to be here. No, he doesn't. That's why he's still there and he's got a family now. The only thing I saw that wasn't working out well for him was because they can travel wherever they want, anytime they want, on the government's dime, as long as they're enrolled in school and it's their education that takes them to that destination. They all stay in school their entire lives and they all travel all over the world because of it. And you've got too many people with PhDs and advanced level degrees and not enough jobs for them because it's a tiny little island. So that's the one thing I see that wasn't working out. But it shocked me that, man, we've been lied to about this for so long. And so after that trip, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start, conducting these adventure travel expeditions and travel to places that I really want to go and have the adventures that I want to have now because I can finally do that again. And so I started traveling to some of the most remote places in the world. And I've met a headhunter now, and I've met a cannibal who has become a great friend of mine. I've seen some really beautiful places, and I've seen some stuff that had I not seen it firsthand, I wouldn't understand it, And so like the animal markets, I've been to one. I understand it. And as a lover of dogs, it was really hard for me to go there knowing that I was going to see dogs brutally killed and cooked in front of me. But when you're there and you understand that, those people have to eat dogs and they have to eat spiders and they have to eat bats and weird stuff because they live in the middle of the jungle and there isn't a safe way for 3 days by plane, and that's all they can get. It's fish and what they can scrounge around. And the dogs, where I was at, it wasn't the indigenous population farming the dogs to bring to market. It was the Muslims who had moved into that area, who don't like the dogs and wanted a source of protein. And since cattle can't survive there, they started farming dogs and selling them to the locals. And that's the way that started. When you understand it, it's way less brutal because it's either do what you got to do and eat what you got to eat to survive or die, But when we look at it through our Western eyes, through American eyes, where we're used to being able to go to the Safeway and get a steak anytime we want, or go through the drive-through, we don't stop and think that there's people on this earth still in this modern day that their cultures have only known modern society for 25 years, maybe max, and now that I've met some of those people and I've been to their villages and I've seen how they live, I totally understand how they live. And I accept it because that's how they have to do it. And they don't have the ability to make it any better because of where they choose to live, and they shouldn't have to choose to live anywhere else. So how can we fault them for how they live and what they're forced to do to survive in those areas? And when I started understanding, when I met my friend, the headhunter, and he explained headhunting to me, and it's a thing of honor that only occurs during the tribal wars, which hasn't happened for over 20 years. And it was a way for a man to prove that he could take care of his future wife, her family, and their village. So you wanted to marry a woman, you had to go to her father during the tribal wars and say, I want to marry your daughter, and he'd send you out and say, go fight in the wars to prove you can protect my daughter, you can protect our family, and you can protect the village, and bring me back X number of heads of the guys you killed to prove that you did what you were supposed to do. That's no different than us bringing back scalps, DNA, ears, fingers, a head, and a box full of dry ice. The stuff that we do that's sanctioned by our government overseas in this very day and age. So for us to fault people because they're still living barefoot and, absolutely primitive with no reliable electricity, that's totally wrong, and so we need to open our eyes as Americans and our minds and understand we can't pass judgment until we go experience it ourselves.
Yeah, well, in order to do that, we have to be open to looking at things from different perspectives instead of, sitting up on this pedestal that we put ourselves on from our superior position and judging everyone. And again, as a whole, I'll say this country, that's exactly what we do. And you make some amazing points. One, even about when we were having this whole discussion about North Korea, and then you had people sitting there going, "Oh, just bomb them, just nuke the hell out of them." It's like, how can you sit there and say that so callously? The North Korean people don't hate Americans. I will guarantee you they do not hate us. Their government doesn't like us, and our government doesn't like them. I don't have anything personal against North Koreans. I don't, I may not agree with their government, but I don't agree with our own government at times, because I know of the bullshit that we've pulled and the kind of, illegal activities that we're part of, and how we've disrupted entire countries and had them overthrown because of the bullshit that we did. And you'll get these nationalists out here who will sit there and just say, America's great, America's number one, and totally neglect or negate the fact of all the things that we've done wrong in this world, because they're a patriot. And it's like, you're not a patriot, you're a nationalist. You put symbolism over substance. And those people, they do it because they're part of that herd mentality, and they want to be seen, and they want to be, part of the right group, but they're not.
Right. What I hate is when those people tell me I'm not patriotic, or that I'm a communist. I've been called a communist. Are you fucking kidding me,
I was gonna say, you better be careful when you're talking about Cuba, because if you say anything nice, the propaganda machine will start running.
I know. Yeah.
Oh, he's a communist. No wonder he's talking bad about cops. It's like,
go there and experience it for yourself, and then come back and we can have a conversation about it. Just like if you don't know what it's like to be deep in the jungles in Malaysia, or deep in the jungles in Indonesia, in ISIS territory, don't try and talk to me about what it's like to be there, because I know I've been there,
Right, exactly. And they haven't, but they'll pretend like they know better than you. So, again, your story is just amazing. What are you doing today? What do you have going on nowadays that you've gotten out of the motorcycle club, that you're no longer in law enforcement? What do you do?
I don't even know how to describe that, man. So obviously, I'll be honest about it. I've lived a hard life, and I'm permanently disabled from PTSD now. It sucks. But what I've done is, I actually didn't get permanently disabled from that until after I got out of doing everything and decided to move on with my life, and had some other bad stuff happen. But what I decided to do was retire. When the PTSD got bad enough, I knew that I'd done too much. You can only do too much tough. There's so much tough guy, and then there's too much, and it just totally fucks your world up. And so I knew I needed to retire, and I started working towards that at the same time that I was considering quitting the club. And so in 2000, and it actually started in 2015, I was really starting to gear myself up to quitting the club and moving forward with my life. But then by 2016, I'd come up with a plan. And my plan was, I want to gear myself towards my retirement, and I want to move away to the mountains and buy myself a large piece of property away from everybody, where I can train badass working dogs, and I can shoot my guns and train people to be badasses, and I can keep my skill set and everything I'm passionate about, I love doing, active and refined, and keep developing it. But I don't have to be the frontline tough guy anymore. I can let others go do that. So I started doing that, and working towards that goal. And in the process, I got recruited by Amazon to go to work as their director of investigations for the Americas, North America, South America, Central America. And I went through the interview process. In the middle of the interview with this guy, he's in his 30s. He's their global director of investigations. And he starts by telling me everything he's done in the investigation world, which was all corporate stuff. He's never done any undercover work. He's never been a detective. It was all crap, compared to what my resume says I've done and what I've done, and I'm like, all right, I let him get his spiel out, and we're talking about this job, which was going to pay me over $250,000 a year, plus give me a bunch of stock. And the only thing I didn't like about it was I was going to have to move to Arizona. Okay, whatever. And we get to the interview, and he's like, okay, well, what's your 5-year goal? And I'm like, I knew they've got this whole process they follow with Amazon. All their interviews are scripted and everything. And so I knew it was coming up. And I'm like, man, my 5-year goal is in the next 5 years, I'm going to move to the mountains, train dogs, and shoot guns. And that's all I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Hang out, enjoy what I've got left on this planet. And he's like, no. I want something realistic, not a fantasy. I was like, really? All right, well, how this about this? Fuck you. I don't need your stupid job. And I got up and that was the end of it. And here we are talking today, and I've got a 40-acre ranch in the mountains with a gorgeous view. I've got my dogs in a beautiful kennel facility up there, and so I'm training dogs. And I decided that rather than being told by other people what I'm going to do and whose battles I'm going to fight and where I'm going to fight them, I want to choose my own battles. And so I've started a nonprofit where we provide training and operational support to counter poaching agencies in Africa and Indonesia. And as well, we take veterans, combat veterans, with PTSD who are looking to transition and apply their skill set to something that they can make an income off of in the private sector. And we teach them, how to train working dogs, because there's a lot of money in working dogs right now, especially as firearms laws, get a lot more stringent.
Right.
And we give them opportunities to go to Africa and work as our instructors there, where we deal with criminal investigations related to poaching, because poaching is all tied into organized crime and terrorism. We teach them tracking and some other fundamental skills that they really need our level of training and expertise, because they're behind us quite a bit. But yeah, it's that's what I'm doing now. So I've got that going. And then the books have the first book just came out a couple of weeks ago, and that's led to some work on a movie that as soon as the COVID restrictions get lifted, we can start filming. I'll be doing that. And I'll be doing some technical advisor work. So I really don't know what I do right now. I give a lot to the rest of the world to protect it. I got my own revenue coming in from doing some tactical training and some consulting, some expert work. But I'm just trying to enjoy life and have fun at this point and be left alone.
Well, three things I want to say. One is, it's admirable in what you're doing now, and especially with the wildlife trade, with the poaching and everything. I'm a big fan of rhinos. I don't know how it happened. I just became a big fan of theirs, and I know that they're in many areas their numbers have dwindled to almost nothing. Like Sumatra, right. There's like maybe 100 left in all of
82.
82, yeah. And it's just ridiculous, and all because of their horn, because of some belief that it makes you sexually competent or whatever. It's
right.
Stupid. But regardless, so I applaud you for that. And the other thing is, I was going to say, dude, I'm glad you wrote the books, and for all the listeners out there, you want a fantastic read. I encourage you to read this book, Patriot Gangster. It's again, I sit there and I go, this is unbelievable. It's like a Hollywood movie. And that brought me to, you need to contact Netflix, and you need to get not a movie, but a series, because there's just too much there to put in one movie that this could be several seasons.
I'm hoping that we can do something like that. I would be very open to it. The biggest problem that I've got is, you mentioned it earlier, media. The mainstream media is so financially invested in law enforcement. For me to tell my story, which makes more sense than theirs does, as you read through and I explain, it's not popular. It's going to cost them revenue. And so we'll see what happens. The film that I'm going to be involved with, it probably will go to Netflix, but that's not specifically about my story and my life. I'd be open to it. The big thing is I don't want it to go Sons of Anarchy. And
I'm sorry, you don't want it what?
I don't want my story to be turned into Sons of Anarchy and
right.
A bunch of lies and sensationalized bullshit. And every publisher that wanted to deal with me on the book wanted to add in a bunch of stuff that just wasn't true, or that I wouldn't talk about, because nobody needs to know those secrets. And I don't want that to happen with the movie. I mean, is there violence in the book? Yeah, there's some violence in the book. But it's not, this over the top gun battles in the middle of the street stuff, because that just doesn't go on.
Right.
And when it does, it's usually instigated by federal law enforcement. Like the Twin Peaks incident in 2015 down in Waco, Texas. That was another debacle that was actually started by an DEA confidential informant who was on contract being paid threw the first punch in that, you know, and it's because they know they can throw that first punch and nobody's going to believe the other side. When you're a brand name 1% motorcycle club, nobody's going to believe you.
Well, see, that's why I think that you brought that up. I think there's a trend that's starting to happen because more and more people are becoming, if you want to use the term, woke to what is going on in this country with our police departments and our federal agencies, and seeing that you're not these upstanding agencies that everyone believed them to be, and that that they've been corrupted to at least to some extent, to where they do end up lying about the things that they do and how things are done. And so with Waco, that was just one of the movies, but there's another series that Netflix is in contract with talking about Manson and everything that went down there, and how that was how the government was behind giving LSD to these people.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of this coming to light, and I think that now that companies like Netflix see, there's money that can be made because people are waking up to this and do want to hear this, that your story might very well be one of those stories that they'd want to tell. And I understand you want to keep the dignity of everything, and to where they don't exaggerate it and make it into something that it isn't. So
I don't look at myself as a bad man. Have I committed crimes over the course of my life? Yes, I absolutely have. Were they crimes that I think I deserve to be in prison for? Fuck no.
Right.
But they were technically crimes, and I've had a lot worse crimes committed against me by law enforcement officers. So, I really don't think of myself as a bad guy, but I will forever be labeled an organized criminal and a gangster. And, that's really unfortunate, because you don't understand how that impacts your life until it actually happens to you. Everybody thinks they want to be John Gotti until you're actually John Gotti. Right. I don't want to be on top of the pyramid, and I left the club world in February of 2017, but I'm still targeted almost every single month, and like I was telling you earlier, it was just last year that they got me kicked out of dog training school. It wasn't like I was doing anything illegal. I was training dogs to go create a dog army and fight some outlaw motorcycle club war. I was trying to get a legal income that would allow me to do what I wanted to do with my life, along with my PTSD and my physical injuries that I've got now that I deal with. And so, there was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing criminal about that. And what did they do? They stepped in and intimidated and harassed one of my very best friends until he had to kick me out of his dog trainers academy just to stay in the country and keep his business going, and in the end, it cost me my entire retirement fund that I had saved up, and invested to go through his school. So, I'm not the bad guy. They're the bad guy for sure, but I'm the one that carries around the label, every day for the rest of my life. I will.
Yeah.
And every time any law enforcement officer runs my record, I come back with an officer safety warning, not because I deserve it, but because of who they say I am. And they don't have to prove any of that when they put it in the system. They just have to say it, and then it stays forever. So that's, it is what it is. But that's why I can't tolerate or allow for anybody to sensationalize my personal story, because it's just going to make it easier to stop looking at me as Jeff Burns, the man, and start looking at me as Twitch, the gangster, and that's not what I ever was. That's not what I am. There was no point in the outlaw motorcycle club world where I looked at myself as a gangster, and that's what I wanted to do, was make a bunch of money, get a bunch of reputation for violence, and dodge prison for the rest of my life. That was never a thought in my mind. And I never ran across, well, I can't say I never ran across. Occasionally you would run across those guys in the motorcycle club world, but they'd very quickly be put out in bad standing by their club, because they'd live that out. They'd act that out once they became a member, and the club wouldn't tolerate it because it would bring too much heat and drama on the club, and so, yeah, if my story gets told, it would be great. I would love it. But, I just don't, I want it to maintain its integrity.
Well, I hope it does get told, because it's a fascinating story. I can't tell, I've never met another person who was a one percenter in a motorcycle club, a law enforcement agent, a bodybuilder, world traveler.
E-racer, dog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, just like I said, when I first read your bio there, I was like, holy shit, I thought I lived a good life. I mean, I thought I did a lot, not even close. So you just so fascinating. For people who want to get in touch with you, where can they reach you? Like, I know you have Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, all those, or?
I've got Facebook, LinkedIn. There's a YouTube. I haven't really done a whole lot with the YouTube yet, but that's coming when I get some spare time. The best place to get in contact with me is through the website for the books, patriotgangster.com. You can contact me directly there. You can find out more about me. There's information on the books and the upcoming release dates for the other two. The next one's coming out in October. The one after that, the third and final one of the trilogy, will be coming out on my birthday in February. And then I've got a fourth book that I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but I'm writing it with Dr. William L. Dulaney, who was also a one percenter. He's a professor of national security. He's a former special operator. Another guy like me, just much more book smart than I am. He and I are actually, we're focusing on the evolution of outlaw motorcycle gang investigations and how they turned into law enforcement criminal enterprises that are, the motive is careerism and money. And so that one, I'm not sure, like I said, he's dealing with some health issues right now, so it's going to be a little while, but I've written my part, and hopefully it'll be out sometime next year.
Well, I'll tell you, the fact that you're writing all these books and that you've written these books, I'm still stuck on my first one. So maybe I'll get some tips from you on how to finish the damn thing. But again, I would love to have you back on when you get the other books out, because there's so much that we haven't even talked about. I wanted to talk about Stolen Valor because you mentioned that. So again, when people go to your website, patriotgangster.com,
correct, yes.
They'll see like you have blogs and stuff, and the blogs are amazing. And I was like, I could spend. I wish I had more time to read more of them, but I read the ones that I could in time for this episode, and I didn't even get to read the Stolen Valor one because I really wanted to hear about that.
I can tell you all about that.
So. Well, here's what I want to do, because I believe it or not, we're already at 2.5 hours. I can't even believe. I mean, the time has flown, and I love that. That tells me what a great guest you've been. So I appreciate it. But I definitely want to have you back on. I'll make sure to write that down as one of the topics that we touch on when you come back. So I'm glad. I hope you had as good a time as I had having you on here.
I had a great time. This has been a lot of fun. And, real quick, I encourage anyone who's listening to this to read the blogs. They really discuss the evolution of outlaw motorcycle gang investigations and how that false narrative came into play. And I think they do it a lot of justice. It's the first time that anybody's ever shared that perspective. And to back up my side of the story, I use the books and direct quotes from the undercover ATF agents who have investigated outlaw motorcycle clubs, because as they wrote their books, they've all let the statute of limitations expire on the crimes they committed while they were undercover agents. And so they start talking about the crimes that they commit. And that's how I evidence what they're doing, because they admit to it in their own words. So a lot of it's through my own personal experiences, observations, and then my own training, because I had the same undercover training as these guys had. But then I use their own words, because there's nothing worse than when they've used our own words against us, using their own words against them to make sure that they get to eat a little crow too.
Well, and I encourage everyone to go to your site, read the blogs as well, because again, there's so much information there that in the fact that it is backed up by their own words. It just it puts a nail in the coffin, if you ask me. So
I'm sure I'm going to get murdered by a dirty cop over.
I was going to say, are you ever afraid that somebody's going to come after you because of this, or
I've had numerous death threats because of the book, and none of them have been from the motorcycle club community. Actually, I take that back. I had one, but he wasn't in a motorcycle club. He was just one of these hangers-on who doesn't know anything he's talking about. But most of the threats I've gotten have been from law enforcement officers, and I've had to take steps to protect myself. And You know, those threats were run through a government agency. They deemed them valid, and now they're protecting me a little bit too. So not really. They don't do a good job, but
Yeah.
I feel better than being totally out there on my own. So
I'm sure you do just as good, if not a better
and
job.
all three books are in the hands of a very prominent congressman on the Judiciary and Oversight committees, just in case something happens to me.
Wow.
You know, he'll make sure that there's accountability.
Well, I'm looking forward to having you back on when you put these other books out, and we will talk about those books, and we'll talk about the other topics as well. And because again, I knew coming into this, there was no way I was going to be able to touch on all the topics I wanted to touch on, because there's just so much of it, and yet it's all important, and it's all necessary, I believe, for the public to become aware of and let them know what's really going on.
That's the main reason I wrote the book, is after what I saw happen at that Mongols trial, where they put a man in jail for telling the truth because he testified against his plea agreement. I'm like, nope, he did the right thing. I got to stand up.
Jeff,
I'm
thankful. Yeah. I'm thankful that there are people still like you around that do the right thing, and that are about deeds and not words. So thank you for everything.
Thank you. It's going to get my status in the club changed, I'm sure, but I don't care. It's all about my honor and my integrity and protecting a culture which deserves being protected. And they do. The Outlaw Motorcycle Club culture is not a threat to America's safety.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you again for being such a great guest, and we'll have you back on soon, okay?
Thank you.
All right, friends. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, take care and be safe.